The maternity ward was cozy, like basking in the sun. Emily, cuddling her baby, must have been super happy. Want to hold her? Emily asked John, who seemed a bit nervous. John scratched his head, feeling awkward. I might drop her. Maybe later. Emily glanced at me, seeming proud as she focused on her baby. It was like she was trying to show off compared to me, someone without kids. I wish I had a kid, John muttered cheerfully, looking at Emily. Trying not to laugh, I replied seriously, "Well, isn't there one right in front of you?" John and Emily looked confused until someone walked in and handed them something that made their faces go pale. I'm Sarah, 29 years old. My husband John is turning 32, and we're celebrating our 5th year of marriage. We both work at the same company, but in different departments. We met at work and fell in love. John, a successful salesperson, was quite popular among the female employees for his charm and sales skills. Before we got to know each other, I used to admire him from afar whenever we crossed paths in the hallway. Our first real interaction happened by chance when he helped me pick up some documents I dropped. Sorry, thank you so much. No, it was my fault for bumping into you. No, not at all. I was just spacing out. No, it was me. We couldn't help but find the situation amusing as we exchanged nods back and forth. As we picked up the documents, we shared a laugh and locked eyes. After that, we started chatting whenever we met in the hallway and occasionally went out for drinks or dinner. John's stories about his sales experiences were fascinating, and I understood why he excelled in his job. When we decided to tie the knot, some of my female colleagues were surprised. I left my job when we got married and became a homemaker. But circumstances led me back to work 2 years ago, though at a different company from John's. Since then, we've been working hard together. Although we still have a mortgage, we've managed to buy our own condo and save a bit. Our relationship may not be as romantic as when we first got married, but I believe we're doing well. Sometimes John comes home late, but when he's early, he pitches in with household chores, saying, "You're working too, Sarah. It's only fair." My friends envy me, saying, "You've got yourself a great husband." But we do have our share of problems, the biggest being our struggle to have children. We both adore kids and have dreamed of starting a family since we got married. Yet after 5 years, we're still childless. With my age creeping up, I'm starting to consider fertility treatment seriously. Surprisingly, John seems more relaxed about it lately. A few months ago, he was enthusiastic about starting a family together, but lately he seems less interested. He stopped bringing up the topic of children altogether. "Don't you want kids anymore?" I asked him one day. John looked surprised. "Why would you think that?" he replied. Feeling a bit frustrated, I said, "Because you haven't mentioned it lately." John gave me a gentle smile. "That's not true, Sarah. I do want to have children with you, but I don't want to pressure you," he explained, hugging me comfortingly. Another concern is the strained relationship between John and my dad. My mom assures me they'll warm up to each other eventually. But whenever John is around my dad, he seems tense. It makes me wonder if they'll ever really get along. It's understandable though, considering my dad is the executive vice president of John's company. When John first came to my house to meet my parents, he was so nervous he could hardly speak. My dad even teased him, "You're one of my salesmen, right?" I got defensive, saying, "John is the best salesman." My dad laughed it off, assuring John it was just a joke, which finally made John smile. Sometimes I worry that John faces challenges at work because his father-in-law knows everything he does. When I bring up my concerns, John brushes them off. "It's not so bad when you're the son-in-law of the executive VP. Even the bosses treat you differently," he says. "I'm not taking advantage of it, but they're just more understanding," he adds. "But doesn't that make work tougher for you?" I ask. "Nope," he replies, laughing, seemingly unfazed by the situation. The truth is, there's another reason for the tension between John and my dad. 2 years ago, John had a financial mishap unrelated to work, and my dad helped him out. It was a big deal, and it's why I went back to work. I think John feels guilty about it, even though my dad never brings it up. I can see John wants to make my dad proud, not just as a salesman, but as his son-in-law too. Since we don't have kids, we often go on dates on our days off. One day, after watching a movie, we ran into one of John's coworkers while strolling around town looking for a place to eat. "Was surprised to see you here," Emily exclaimed, spotting us first. This is one of my coworkers. They also got married after we did. From an office romance, John explained. Emily, who was noticeably pregnant, mentioned she was about to start maternity leave. Thanks for always looking out for my husband, Emily said, her expression twitching slightly. Oh, it's nothing really, I replied, trying to keep it light, but I sensed some tension. It felt like she wasn't entirely friendly towards me. Hey, that's not nice, Emily, her husband scolded her. Sorry about that. We really appreciate your support, he said. He seemed younger than me but easygoing and friendly. He probably excelled in sales with his calm demeanor. It seemed Emily got along well with John, even touching his arm in front of me, his wife. Her husband Tom watched her with a mix of surprise and irritation. What are you two up to? Her gaze towards me felt challenging. John sensed my discomfort and quickly intervened to ease the tension. Maybe Tom harbored suspicions about John and Emily's relationship just like I did. Honestly, I didn't have the best impression of Emily. But I was starting to see Tom in a different light. Once doubts creep in, they're hard to shake. While I didn't think Emily, visibly pregnant, would go to a hotel with John, the possibility of infidelity crossed my mind. Deciding to take action rather than dwell on it, I hired a detective and purchased hidden cameras. I installed them in key areas of the house while the detective monitored John's activities outside. If he was cheating, we'd find out. If not, things would return to normal. I often unwind with long baths, finding solace in the warm water. Soaking for at least an hour is my way of rejuvenating. If John was cheating, this would be an opportune time for him. With my smartphone in hand, I checked on John's activities while soaking. Most days, he seemed to be watching TV or working, but occasionally he appeared to be communicating with someone. The motion detecting cameras ensured I wouldn't miss anything, even when I wasn't actively watching. I meticulously reviewed the recordings and audio, and to put it bluntly, my trust in John was shattered. To compound matters, I discovered that John was the father of Emily's baby. While watching the footage, I couldn't help but gasp in disbelief. John was on the phone with Emily, inquiring, "Is our baby all right?" Though I couldn't hear her response, his serious tone indicated he wasn't joking when he replied, "That's wonderful news." During one of John's bath times, I checked his phone and was stunned by the messages exchanged between him and Emily. "Are you okay?" "No suspicions." "Don't worry, he doesn't even know he's infertile." It was a devastating blow to his pride as a man. It felt too heartbreaking to confront him with the truth. Reading their conversation left me feeling unsettled. I couldn't help but wonder if Emily cheated because her husband, Tom, was sterile, or if John justified his infidelity because I wasn't getting pregnant. I scrolled through their exchanges, taking screenshots with my smartphone as evidence. Additionally, I retrieved Tom's contact details from John's phone. Wouldn't anyone in my shoes feel the same desire for revenge upon discovering this betrayal? They say misery loves company, and I made sure to gather ample evidence before reaching out to Tom, just in case he doubted Emily's infidelity or decided to take her side and thwart my plans. I arranged to meet Tom at the cafe without informing Emily or John. To avoid raising suspicion, I called ahead and informed him about Emily and John's affair. He didn't appear overly shocked or distressed when he arrived. When I thanked him for coming, he simply nodded. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you, Sarah, about something," he said. Curious, I inquired, but Tom insisted on hearing my side first. He explained that revealing John's betrayal would be a betrayal in itself, and he needed a compelling reason to do so. I presented Tom with the evidence gathered by the detective and the proof I had collected. As he examined the images discussing sterility, his expression twisted in disbelief. "Emily seems certain about this here. Do you know anything about it?" I shared that we'd been married for 3 years and underwent testing about a year into our marriage. Tom and Emily had been eager to start a family early on, so he found it strange that they hadn't succeeded after a year. After the testing, I never actually saw the results myself. Emily assured me everything was fine on her end, he explained. Listening to his side, I realized the depth of the deception. I pondered why Emily didn't divorce Tom, knowing he couldn't have children. "Oh, that's because Emily is in debt," Tom explained. Apparently, Emily's desire to flaunt her lifestyle led her to rack up debts buying designer bags and clothes she couldn't afford on her salary. Now they were working together to pay off the debt, with the condition that Emily would curb her extravagant spending. Remembering Emily's behavior last time I saw her, her need for attention and luxury made sense. She probably felt threatened by John's attention to me and maybe wanted to make Tom jealous too. Debt, huh? Sounds like a perfect match for John. I blurted out, earning a puzzled look from Tom. In gratitude for his honesty, I decided to share something about John from 2 years ago. Interesting, Tom remarked with a smirk, clearly thinking along the same lines as me. I'm considering a divorce, I confessed. Me too. It's comforting to know you're thinking the same, Tom replied. Then he revealed something he had been holding back. Was your first encounter with John really accidental? He asked. I nodded. Yes, I dropped my documents and John helped me pick them up. It wasn't an accident, Tom interjected. What? He did it on purpose to create an opportunity? According to Tom, John had noticed my interest in him for a while. Tom was convinced that given the opportunity, John could get close to me. As I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment at my own obviousness, Tom continued. If his interest had solely been in you, Sarah, it would have been one thing. But that wasn't the case. How so? I inquired. Because of who you are, the executive's daughter. John seemed quite pleased when he boasted to Tom about getting close to the executive director's daughter, meaning me. He seemed to view marrying me as a shortcut to advancing his career. It all makes sense now. That's why he was so mindful of my father and got so jittery when he met us, I realized. He even went around at work telling people he could easily talk to my father-in-law, the executive director, John bragged. I hadn't known about this since I'd left the company. John had brushed it off, claiming people were just being considerate on their own. But that's not the case. He married me to exploit me, to use my father's position as a threat. Yet he turns into a nervous wreck in front of my dad. It's pathetic, I confided in Tom. Can you get tested again? I'll do the same, I suggested. As for John and Emily, I had no intention of forgiving either of them. John had been antsy and excited for days leading up to the celebration of the birth. What should we get for the celebration? It's a boy. He'd exclaim happily, selecting gifts. The maternity ward greeted us with warmth and sunlight upon our arrival. Emily and Tom warmly welcomed us, and when John presented the clothes he had chosen, Emily's face lit up with joy. Tom excused himself to fetch drinks. With John attentively watching, Emily held the baby, radiating happiness. Would you like to hold him? John asked me with a smile, surrounded by our colleagues. John hesitated, scratching his head. Nah, he mumbled, glancing at me. Sensing my lack of enthusiasm, he quickly composed himself. I'm afraid I might drop him. Maybe later, he added sheepishly. Emily glanced at me, then chuckled, focusing back on the baby. It was evident she was subtly competing with me, knowing I didn't have children. I'd love to have a kid of my own, John remarked cheerfully, his gaze fixed on Emily. I almost laughed out loud at his comment but managed to maintain a serious expression. Well, isn't there one right in front of you? I quipped, trying to sound casual. Both John and Emily looked at me with confusion just as the door to the ward swung open abruptly. Tom entered with a couple of bottles of water, apologizing for the delay as he handed them out, slipping a folded piece of paper to Emily. Emily's expression shifted from confusion to shock as she unfolded the paper, revealing a divorce notice. What is this, some kind of joke? She exclaimed in disbelief. John, equally stunned, glanced at the document in her hand. Come on, Tom, this isn't the time for jokes. It's in poor taste, John remarked, his tone flat. It's no joke, Tom replied firmly. Emily's confusion turned to pale confusion, while John moved to confront Tom. I stepped in front of John and handed him my own set of divorce papers already unfolded. I'm not joking either, I declared. Moving to Emily's bedside, I laid out photos showing John visiting her house frequently during her maternity leave. What were you doing at my house when my husband wasn't home? I demanded. John, attempting to explain, claimed he was merely being considerate, checking in on Emily since they started at the company together. Yeah, John was just being thoughtful, Emily chimed in defensively. Their attempts to justify themselves seemed almost comical, as if they could talk their way out of the situation. It was absurd, especially considering their late-night communications. Was that concern for Emily or for the child in her belly, perhaps your own? I challenged John, sensing his anger rising. Stop it, Sarah. Emily is my colleague, and it's natural for her to be anxious about her first child. John retorted, his tone sharp. You're just jealous of me, aren't you? Just because you can't have kids, Emily interjected defensively, her words dripping with venom. I couldn't help but snort at her accusation, which only seemed to fuel her anger as she glared at me, her face flushed with frustration. "Don't listen to her, Tom. This child is truly yours," Emily insisted, attempting to divert attention from the conversation. But Tom's mocking laugh coincided with me showing Emily the incriminating evidence on my smartphone. A recording of John joking about his own infertility, followed by a video of him inquiring about the well-being of our child. "See, should we check who you were really talking to?" I challenged as Emily's bravado faltered in the face of undeniable proof. "We're just coworkers, joking around," Emily stammered, trying to regain her composure. I glanced down at her with pity as she met my gaze defiantly. "Hold on to him properly, Emily. He's a precious life," I advised gently as the baby stirred in her arms, almost falling. The sudden cry of the baby pierced the tense atmosphere. "Shut up," Emily snapped, just as Tom unfolded a piece of paper. "I can't have kids, Emily. You know that." Tom's voice was calm but laced with bitterness as he addressed his wife, who froze under his gaze. "Let's get a divorce," we both declared to our partners, the finality of the decision hanging heavily in the air. John, still attempting to salvage the situation, pointed a finger at me. "This is all because of your infertility, Sarah. There must be something wrong with you, just like with Tom," he accused. I felt a surge of anger rise within me. "It's not me, it's you, John. And don't you dare speak to me with such arrogance, especially when we're on the brink of divorce," I retorted, tossing the test results in his direction. The paper briefly stuck to his face before fluttering to the ground. "Who do you think you are, speaking to me like that? Did you believe blaming me would absolve you of your actions?" I demanded, spelling it out for him once more. "Divorce. Do you even comprehend the gravity of that word?" John's face drained of color as he stammered an apology, begging for forgiveness. "Huh." Emily's astonished voice interjected as John pleaded. Tom and I exchanged a knowing glance and chuckled softly, reflecting on John's past mistake of accumulating a hefty debt through stock trading, which my father had covered. I had started working to repay it. My father's assistance came with a condition. John signed a promissory note. In addition to alimony, John would now face relentless pursuit for repayment from my father. With Emily's debt added to the mix, their future looked bleak. "Well, best of luck to you both. You'll need it. We'll settle the rest through our lawyers," I declared, leaving John on the floor in tears as Tom and I exited the hospital room. My father, even angrier than me, enlisted the help of a lawyer he trusted to extract every cent from John, even tapping into John's share of our joint assets. But it still wasn't enough. John, now remarried to Emily but unaware of each other's financial burdens, faced criticism from Emily's parents upon discovering the truth, leading to yet another divorce. Emily's parents, while temporarily covering her debts, eventually had to send her back home, where she endured daily reproach. Despite the hardships, their grandchild, the innocent babe, was showered with love and lacked for nothing, which eased my concerns. John, unable to remain at the company, resigned and now resides in a modest apartment, toiling from dawn till dusk to meet his obligations of debt, alimony, and child support. Meanwhile, I've settled into a rented apartment, embracing solitary living. Tom and I have become drinking buddies, meeting up on weekends for quiet moments of camaraderie. He may not be as chatty as John, but I appreciate the peaceful companionship he offers.
I'm Bella, 27, and by no means a pushover. I work as a secretary, a job that has me juggling calls and coffee, all while trying to keep a straight face when my boss cracks one of his stale jokes. Life was a regular routine until that night at a friend's party when I bumped into Jake. Jake was a tall, lanky guy with a smile that could light up the room. He had that effortless charm about him, cracking jokes one minute and deep in thought the next. We got talking, and before I knew it, hours had passed. "Hey, I'm Jake. You look like you could use a better drink than that," he said, nodding at the almost empty plastic cup in my hand. I raised an eyebrow, "And you look like you've got a better suggestion?" "Follow me and find out," he grinned, leading the way to where the real party was, a table laden with all sorts of drinks. We spent the evening talking about everything and nothing. His jokes were actually funny, a refreshing change from the dry humor I was used to at work. As the party wound down, we exchanged numbers. "Don't be a stranger," Jake said as he left. Or do, but only if you're into that mystery vibe. I laughed, tucking away his number. We'll see, funny guy. As I headed home, I couldn't shake off the feeling that this was the beginning of something. But that night, it was just the city lights, the lingering laughter from the party, and the slight buzz from the drinks. The next few weeks were a blur of texts and calls with Jake. He was like a breath of fresh air, always popping up with a joke or a plan to meet up. It was hard not to get swept up in his energy. Then came the day he invited me over to his place. You gotta meet the folks, he said casually, as if it wasn't a big deal. Meet your parents? I hesitated. Aren't we moving a bit fast? Nah, they're cool. Plus, I want them to meet the girl who's been stealing all my time, he joked, but I could tell he was serious. I agreed, not knowing what I was walking into. Looking back, I wish I had taken a bit more time, maybe then I would have seen what was coming. But life doesn't give you a heads up, does it? No, it just throws you in the deep end and watches as you try to swim. The day to meet Jake's parents came quicker than I'd have liked. I remember standing in front of my closet, trying to pick out something that said nice to meet you, and not, I'm here to steal your son. Finally, settling on a simple dress, I took a deep breath and headed out. Jake's house was one of those big, sprawling places with a garden out front. Flowers, trees, you name it, his mom had it growing there. She'll love to show you around, Jake had said with an enthusiasm I didn't quite share. As we walked up to the door, Jake squeezed my hand. Don't worry, they're going to love you. The door swung open, and there stood Mrs. Green, a woman with a stern look that could make a grown man flinch. So, this is her, she said, eyeing me from head to toe. Not exactly the warm welcome I was hoping for. Mom, this is Bella. Bella, my mother, Jake introduced. Charmed, I said, extending my hand. She gave a nod, her lips tight. Come in. Let's not stand around. The inside of the house was as immaculate as the garden. We sat in the living room, and that's when the interrogation began. Mrs. Green didn't waste any time. So, Bella, Jake tells us you're a secretary. That must be interesting, she said, the word interesting hanging in the air like it was a bad smell. Yeah, it's got its moments. Keeps me on my toes, I replied, trying to keep it light. And your boss, he's a man, I presume, she prodded, her eyes narrowing. I nodded. Yes, he is. A very professional and respectful one. Mrs. Green hummed, as if she had expected as much. I suppose you spend a lot of time together, being his secretary and all. I could feel the insinuation heavy in her tone. Jake jumped in. Mom, come on, let's not start this. No, it's okay, I said, feeling a need to defend myself. We work together, but that's it. There's nothing more. Mrs. Green looked at me, then at Jake, and then back to me. I see. Well, as long as it's professional. The conversation stumbled on, every topic somehow circling back to my job or my relationship with my boss. It was like she had a one-track mind set on making me uncomfortable. At one point, Jake excused himself to take a call, leaving me alone with his mother. You know, my son could do a lot better than a secretary, she said, her voice low but clear. I was taken aback. I'm sorry you feel that way. I care a lot about Jake, and I'm not here to cause any trouble. Mrs. Green stood up, her posture rigid. Just so we're clear, I have my eye on you. Any slip up, and I'll make sure Jake sees sense. The threat hung between us, heavy and cold. I sat there, trying to process what just happened. It was clear this wasn't going to be easy. When Jake came back, I plastered a smile on my face, but inside, I was reeling. After a few months of dating, Jake and I decided it was time to take the next step, moving in together. I remember the day I left my small, cozy apartment, boxes in hand, a mix of excitement and nerves bubbling in my stomach. Jake was all grins, helping me settle into what was now our place. It was nice, waking up next to him every morning, sharing coffee and lazy weekends. But as they say, good things never last, especially if Mrs. Green has anything to say about it. One Saturday morning, as we were lounging around, the doorbell rang. Jake went to answer it, and in came Mrs. Green, her eyes scanning the room like she was looking for something, or rather, someone to criticize. "Mother, what a surprise," Jake said, clearly caught off guard. "Save it, Jacob. I know what's going on here," she snapped, her eyes finally landing on me. "Living in sin, are we?" Jake's face turned red. "Mom, it's not like that. We're serious about each other." She scoffed. "Serious? Please. You barely know her." I stood up, feeling the need to defend our relationship. "Mrs. Green, I care about Jake, and we're happy together." "Happy?" She laughed, a harsh sound that filled the room. "Let's see how happy you are when the novelty wears off." She walked around, inspecting the place like she was going to find something incriminating. Her eyes landed on a photo of Jake and me at a beach. "And what's this?" "Hardly appropriate, wouldn't you say?" Jake tried to intervene. "Mom, that's enough." But she was on a roll. "I won't have my son shacking up with just anyone. What will people think?" I could feel the anger rising in me. "We're not hurting anyone. We're adults, making our own decisions." Mrs. Green turned to me, her gaze sharp. "You may have fooled my son, but you don't fool me. I see right through you." The argument escalated from there, voices raised, words thrown like punches. In the end, Mrs. Green left, but not before declaring, "This isn't over." Her visit left a sour taste, the tension hanging between Jake and me. We tried to brush it off, go about our day, but it wasn't the same. Her words echoed in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the disapproval looming over us. As days turned into weeks, the strain grew. Small arguments became regular, each one chipping away at the happiness we had built. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Green was somewhere out there, smirking, pleased with the chaos she had sown. One night, I worked late. The project was a beast, and everyone had left except me and my boss, who was in his office doing who knows what. "Bella, you still here?" my boss called out as he finally emerged. "Yeah, just finishing up this report," I replied, stretching my arms. "Late night, huh? Let me drive you home." "It's not safe this late," he offered. I was tired, the thought of waiting for a bus wasn't appealing, so I agreed. We walked to his car, making small talk about the day. It was all very normal until we pulled up to my place. "Thanks for the ride," I said, reaching for the door. "No problem, Bella. See you tomorrow," he replied with a tired smile. As I got out of the car, I didn't notice Jake standing there, his face a mix of anger and hurt. I realized too late as he stormed towards me. "Bella, what the hell is this?" Jake shouted, his eyes darting from me to my boss driving away. "It's not what it looks like, Jake. He was just giving me a ride home," I tried to explain. "A ride home? At this hour? With him?" He was fuming, not listening to a word I said. "Jake, please, you're overreacting. It's late, I was alone at the office, and he offered to drive me. That's all," I pleaded. "All, huh? And I'm supposed to believe that?" His voice was loud, attracting a few glances from neighbors. "I'm telling you the truth. Why won't you believe me?" My voice cracked, the frustration and hurt bubbling up. "Because I know men like him. And you, out late, with your boss? It's not right," he accused. "Jake, you're being ridiculous. Nothing is going on." "I love you," I said, my voice firm. He scoffed. "Yeah? Well, it sure doesn't look like it." The argument went back and forth, each accusation more hurtful than the last. Eventually, he stormed off, leaving me standing there, alone and bewildered. I grabbed a few essentials and headed back to my old place. The night was quiet, but my mind was a loud mess of thoughts and worries. I couldn't believe a simple act of kindness from my boss would lead to this. No sooner had I settled into my old, now strangely unfamiliar bed, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Green. Her voice oozed satisfaction. "Well, Bella, seems like you've moved back. Can't say I'm surprised." I knew it was only a matter of time. Her laughter was cold, ringing in my ears long after I had hung up. I lay there, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I realized then that this was far from over. Her glee at my predicament was just another reminder of the uphill battle I was facing, not just with Jake, but with his entire family. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread for what was yet to come. Life was quiet after the big blowout with Jake. I kept to myself, trying to mend the pieces of my bruised heart. Days turned into weeks, and just as I started to feel a bit like my old self again, life decided to throw me another curveball. I found out I was pregnant. I remember sitting in my bathroom, staring at the positive test. A mix of emotions flooded through me: fear, excitement, but mostly a deep, nagging worry about how Jake would react. I debated telling him, going back and forth in my mind, but eventually, I decided against it. I would raise this child on my own. But secrets have a way of coming out, and this one was no different. Jake found out. I still don't know how, but one day, there he was, standing at my door, looking as shocked and scared as I felt. "Bella, is it true? Are we going to have a baby?" he stammered, his face pale. I nodded, unable to form words. The silence stretched between us, heavy and awkward. "Why didn't you tell me, Bella? Why?" he finally managed, his voice a mix of hurt and anger. I was scared, Jake. Scared of how you'd react, scared of doing this all alone, I confessed, the words tumbling out. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I knew all too well. "We should have talked about it. It's not just your decision, Bella." I knew he was right, but at the moment, it didn't seem that simple. "I know, and I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do." We talked for hours, going in circles, the same arguments, the same fears. But as the night wore on, something shifted. We started to see not just the challenges, but the possibilities. Maybe, just maybe, we could do this together. In a decision that surprised both of us, we agreed to start over. We decided to get married, but this time, we'd do it our way, away from all the drama and judgment. A simple courthouse ceremony, just us and a couple of friends. It was quick, maybe a bit impulsive, but it felt right. The day we got married was nothing like I'd ever imagined. No fancy dress, no big party. Just the two of us, exchanging vows in a small, stuffy room. But when I looked into Jake's eyes, I knew it was perfect. We kept it a secret, not ready to deal with the fallout from his family, especially Mrs. Green. We needed time to adjust, to prepare for the baby, to figure out how we were going to handle everything. It was our little bubble of happiness, fragile, but ours. Jake and I were living in our little world, trying to prepare for the baby's arrival. But we both knew we couldn't keep our secret forever. The day finally came when Jake decided it was time to tell his parents. "We gotta do it, Bella. They need to know about the baby, about us," he insisted one morning, a determined look on his face. I was scared, to say the least. "But what about your mom? You know she's gonna flip." He took my hands in his. "I'll handle Mom. You just focus on you and the baby." So, we went to his parents' house. My heart was pounding as we walked up the driveway. The door opened, and there stood Mrs. Green, looking as stern as ever. "Jacob, what are you doing here?" "And you brought her," she said, eyeing me with disdain. "Mom, we've got something to tell you." "It's important," Jake said, stepping in front of me slightly. She let us in, the curiosity clear on her face. We all sat down, the tension thick in the air. Jake took a deep breath and began. "Mom, Dad, Bella, and I got married a few months back. And we're expecting a baby." There was a moment of stunned silence before Mrs. Green erupted. "Married? A baby? How could you be so irresponsible?" "Mom, it's not like that. We love each other. We're happy," Jake tried to explain. "Happy? Look at her. She's trapped you with this child," Mrs. Green accused, pointing a finger at me. I felt my face heat up. I didn't trap anyone. This baby is a blessing, not a trap. "Don't talk back to me, girl. I know your type," she snapped. Jake stood up, his face red with anger. enough, Mom. This is my life, my wife, my child. If you can't accept that, then maybe we don't need to be part of yours." The room fell silent, Mrs. Green's face red with anger, but there was a flicker of something else, maybe fear, maybe realization. Mr. Green, who had been silent till now, put a hand on her shoulder, a silent plea. She looked at him, then back at us, her face softening just a fraction. I need time to process this." We left shortly after, the air between us heavy but hopeful. As we drove away, Jake squeezed my hand. That went better than expected. I laughed, despite everything. Yeah, if you consider World War III better than expected. But it was out now, the truth. We were married, expecting a baby, and for better or worse, his family knew. It felt like a weight had been lifted, but at the same time, a new worry had settled in. How would Mrs. Green react once the news really sunk in? Would she come around, or would she be an ever-present thorn in our side? Only time would tell, but for now, we had each other, and that was enough. As we drove home, the sun setting in the distance, I felt a sense of peace. We were together, we were strong, and no matter what came our way, we'd face it together, as a family. A few weeks had passed since the big reveal to Jake's parents. Things were quiet, almost eerily so. Then, one afternoon, Mrs. Green showed up at our door, unannounced, with a homemade cake in hand. "Bella, I baked this for you. A peace offering, let's say," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I was taken aback, not sure what to make of this sudden gesture. Thanks, Mrs. Green. That's unexpected." She smiled, a bit too sweetly. "Call me Mother, dear. After all, we are family now." After some awkward small talk, she left, leaving the cake on the kitchen counter. I invited a friend over to share the cake. "Hey, Lisa, wanna come over for some cake?" It's a long story. Lisa arrived, and I cut the cake, serving us both a piece. But as fate would have it, she was on a new diet kick and refused at the last minute. "You know what, I'll take it home for later. My cheat day's tomorrow." She laughed, wrapping up a big slice. I shrugged and took a bite of mine. It was delicious, almond flavor bursting in my mouth. But as the evening wore on, I started feeling odd, queasy. I chalked it up to pregnancy nausea and went to bed early. But the nausea didn't go away, it got worse. By midnight, I was violently ill, and Jake rushed me to the hospital. After what felt like endless tests and worried looks from doctors, they told us the shocking news. There was a toxic substance in my system, something commonly used in gardening to kill pests. Jake's face went white as he realized the implication. "The cake, my mom." I was too weak to respond, a cold dread settling in my stomach. Had Mrs. Green really tried to harm me, to harm her own grandchild? I was kept in the hospital overnight, and by morning, I was feeling a bit better, but the emotional toll was immense. Jake was a mess, torn between worry for me and disbelief that his mother could do such a thing. We were talking on the phone about it, Jake's voice heavy with concern. "We need to figure out what to do next," when suddenly the door to my room creaked open, and in walked Mrs. Green. I quickly muted the phone but didn't hang up, Jake still listening in. "Bella, how are you feeling, dear?" she asked, her voice dripping with faux concern. I looked at her, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. "I'd been better," I said, coldly. She tooted. "Such a shame about the sickness." "And the baby?" "The baby is fine," I replied, watching her reaction closely. Her face faltered for just a moment, a flash of disappointment crossing her features. "Well, that's good to hear," she said, but the words felt hollow. Then, with a smirk, she added, "Of course, you have no proof of what caused your little incident." I made sure of that when I threw away the rest of that cake first thing this morning. My heart raced, Jake still on the line, hearing every word. She had just admitted to it, not realizing the call was still connected. As she turned to leave, I looked down at the phone, a plan forming in my mind. Mrs. Green might think she's covered her tracks, but she was wrong. We had her confession, and now it was time to make her face the consequences. After Mrs. Green left the hospital room, I called Lisa, who thankfully hadn't eaten her piece yet. She was horrified by the news and agreed to bring the cake to the police as evidence. Then I dialed Jake again. "Jake, did you hear all that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, every single word," he replied, anger seething through his tone. "I can't believe she'd go this far. I'm coming back to the hospital, and we're going to the police. We've got her now, Bella." By the time Jake arrived, I had managed to steady my nerves. Together, we went to the police station, the phone recording in hand. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing grimmer with every word Mrs. Green had unwittingly spilled. They assured us they would investigate immediately. The next few days were a blur of police visits, interviews, and a growing sense of dread about what was to come. Mrs. Green was brought in for questioning, and with the evidence stacked against her, she had no choice but to confess to her horrendous act. The news of her arrest spread quickly, and suddenly, the whole town was buzzing about the scandal. Jake stayed by my side through it all, his support unwavering. "I'm so sorry, Bella. I never thought she'd do something like this." "I know, Jake. But we're together in this, that's what matters," I reassured him, squeezing his hand. The trial date was set quickly, given the severity of the crime. Mrs. Green faced the judge, her usual stern demeanor replaced by a look of defeat. The evidence was undeniable, and she was found guilty of attempted poisoning. The sentence was harsh, but just, given the potential consequences of her actions. As we walked out of the courtroom, Jake and I both felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was over, but at such a cost. His mother, the woman who had raised him, was now behind bars because of her own twisted actions. We decided it was time to move on, to focus on the future and the arrival of our baby. The house felt quieter, the air lighter, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. Our friends and family rallied around us, their support a constant source of comfort. One evening, as we sat on the porch, Jake wrapped his arm around me. "We've been through hell, Bella, but we made it. I love you, and I can't wait to start this new chapter with our little one." I leaned into him, my head resting on his shoulder. "Me too, Jake. It's going to be a fresh start for all of us." The baby kicked, as if in agreement, and we both laughed. It was a sound of pure joy, a sign that despite everything, we were going to be okay. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, I realized that justice had been served, not just in the courtroom, but in our lives too. We had been tested, pushed to our limits, but in the end, we emerged stronger, united, and ready to face whatever the future held. My name's Sarah, a 29-year-old accountant with a knack for numbers and a love for a well-balanced budget. I'm married to Alex, a man whose sense of humor is as strong as his love for me. We live in a small, well-appointed apartment I inherited and spruced up over the years. It's our little haven, filled with the laughter and love of a young, happy couple. One lazy Sunday, as I was reconciling some accounts, Alex lounged on the sofa, chuckling at something on his phone. "Hey, money wizard, any chance you can conjure up a feast for lunch?" he joked, looking up at me with a grin. Rolling my eyes, I replied, "With your spending habits? I'd need real magic for that." Our banter was interrupted by the doorbell. It was Mrs. Thompson, Alex's mother, standing at the doorstep with her usual air of disdain hidden poorly behind a strained smile. "Hello, dear," she greeted, her eyes immediately scanning the apartment. "Hi, Mom," Alex said, getting up to hug her. "What brings you here today?" "Oh, just wanted to see how you two are managing in this tiny place," she replied, her voice dripping with a tone that suggested she found our living situation pitiable. I bit my tongue, offering a polite smile. "Would you like some coffee, Mrs. Thompson?" As I set about making coffee, I overheard their conversation from the kitchen. Mrs. Thompson was lamenting her financial difficulties, the costs of maintaining her large, old house apparently overwhelming her. "It's just so much, Alex. I don't know how I'll manage." she sighed dramatically. Alex looked concerned. Mom, we can help out. Maybe we can give you some money each month, help ease the burden? My heart sank. We were doing well, but we weren't wealthy. Still, the thought of his mother struggling was enough for Alex to offer. I brought in the coffee, sitting down as they discussed figures. $1,000 a month? Alex suggested, looking over at me for approval. I nodded, masking my concern. If it helps, Mrs. Thompson, we're happy to help. She accepted with a quick, almost too eager nod. You're such good children. I don't know what I'd do without you. Yet, as she sipped her coffee, her eyes lingered on the renovated kitchen, the sleek appliances, and the comfortable furniture. Of course, if you could afford such nice things for yourselves, maybe you could spare a little more. She mused, her voice trailing off suggestively. Alex was about to speak, but I cut in. We'll start with the 1,000 and see how things go. We have to be mindful of our own expenses, after all. Mrs. Thompson seemed a bit put off, but covered it with a tight smile. Of course, dear. I appreciate anything you can do. After she left, Alex and I sat in a heavy silence. Are we doing the right thing? He finally asked, his brows furrowed in worry. I reached for his hand. We're helping your mom, that's important. But let's not dive into deep waters we can't swim out of, okay? He squeezed my hand back, the weight of our decision settling in. Okay, he agreed, but I could tell the matter wasn't settled in his heart. The rest of the day passed quietly, with both of us lost in our thoughts. The air in the apartment felt different now, charged with the responsibility we had taken on and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Thompson's visit was just the beginning of a larger challenge we would face together. But whatever it was, we'd face it as a team, as we always did. Weeks after Mrs. Thompson's visit, the routine of our life resumed, the uneasy feeling of the financial commitment lingering like a stubborn fog. Then, out of the blue, we got news that turned our world upside down. I was pregnant. The joy was overwhelming. Alex's face lit up like a Christmas tree when I told him, his laughter echoing in the apartment. We're going to be parents, Sarah. Can you believe it? He exclaimed, lifting me in a whirlwind hug. Laughing and a bit dizzy, I replied, believe it? I'm already planning the budget for baby shoes and college. The news of the baby brought a new wave of visits from Mrs. Thompson. One evening, she arrived with an unusual spark in her eye. I have a proposal for you too, she began, settling herself on the sofa as if preparing for a long discussion. Alex and I exchanged a look, trepidation mixing with curiosity. What kind of proposal? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. It's simple. You need more space for the baby, and I need less of a burden. I move in with my daughter, and you move into my house, she declared, her voice carrying a note of finality. I choked on my tea. Move in, to your house? The image of her large, run-down home flashed in my mind, the creaky floors and peeling paint a stark contrast to our cozy apartment. Alex, ever the optimist, chimed in. That's an idea, Mom. But Sarah's right. Your house needs a lot of work. Undeterred, Mrs. Thompson continued. Think of it, Alex. Your child can grow up in the house you did, and with Sarah's knack for budgeting, you can turn it into something beautiful. I could see Alex's eyes soften at the thought, the sentimental value of his childhood home pulling at him. But practicality nipped at my mind. It's a big decision, Mrs. Thompson. And a big project. We need to think it over, discuss the costs, the work. But she was on a roll. You won't get a better offer. Space for the baby, a family home. It's perfect. Think fast, though. I don't want to be a burden on my daughter for long. The conversation spun around us, Alex caught in memories and possibilities, Mrs. Thompson pressing her point, and me, trying to anchor it all in reality. "We'll talk it over," I finally said, cutting through the chatter. "We need time to decide what's best for our family." After she left, the apartment felt too small, the walls closing in with the weight of her proposal. Alex paced, torn between nostalgia and the reality of the massive undertaking. "Sarah, it could be great, right? The baby, the house." "But it's a lot," he said, running his hands through his hair. I took his hands, steadying him. "Let's sleep on it. Make lists, pros and cons. We do this right, or not at all." He nodded, the worry lines easing a bit. "You're right. As always. Let's figure this out together." That night, sleep was elusive, the future a jumble of cribs and construction. But as I lay there, listening to Alex's steady breathing, I knew whatever decision we made, we'd face the consequences, good or bad, as one. The thought was a small comfort in the sea of uncertainty that Mrs. Thompson's unexpected proposal had plunged us into. After many sleepless nights and endless discussions, Alex and I decided to take on the challenge. The prospect of creating a loving home for our baby in his childhood house won over the daunting task ahead. "All right, let's do this. But we're doing it our way, no cutting corners," I declared one morning, determination firm in my voice. Alex smiled, his usual optimism shining through. "That's my girl. It'll be our project, our home." The house stood as I remembered, large and looming, its once grand features now dulled by time and neglect. As we walked through the creaking doors, the reality of what we'd taken on hit me. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" I murmured, more to myself than to Alex. He wrapped an arm around me. "Hey, it's going to be great. A bit of paint here, some new floors there." I raised an eyebrow. "And the plumbing, electrics, heating." My voice trailed off as the list grew longer in my mind. "We brought in a designer, Tom, a friend known for his practical yet stylish eye." "Okay, let's see what we've got," Tom said, clipboard in hand, ready to tackle the beast. Room by room, we assessed, planned, and budgeted. The numbers were dizzying, but every decision was made with our future in mind. The workers started, their presence a constant in the once quiet house. Dust and noise became our new normal, but with each completed task, the place began to transform. One particularly chaotic day, as I navigated through ladders and paint cans, I found Alex staring at the nursery, a soft smile on his face. "Can you imagine it, Sarah? Our little one right here?" I joined him, envisioning the room not as it was, but as it would be. "It'll be beautiful, Alex. The perfect place for baby naps and bedtime stories." The days turned into weeks, and slowly the house began to resemble a home. The sagging ceilings were now sturdy and smooth, the walls fresh with paint. The old, grimy windows replaced with clear glass that let the light flood in. Each evening, we reviewed the progress, our excitement growing with every box ticked off the list. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Delays and unexpected repairs tested our patience and budget. "Another issue? What now?" I'd ask, frustration mounting as Tom relayed the latest hiccup. "Plumbing's older than we thought. Needs more work, but we'll get it done," Tom would assure, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to my frazzled nerves. Despite the setbacks, we pushed forward, driven by the vision of our family in this home. And as the final touches were put in place, the house, once a daunting project, stood proud and welcoming, a testament to our hard work and love. Exhausted but elated, we stepped back, taking in the sight. "We did it, Sarah. We actually did it," Alex said, his voice thick with emotion. I leaned into him, the house behind us no longer just a building, but a symbol of our new beginning. "We sure did, love." Now, let's get ready to welcome our little one into it." With that, we turned and walked into our future, ready for whatever it might hold. Just as we settled into our newly renovated home, savoring the calm after months of relentless work, our world was turned upside down again. It was a crisp Saturday morning, and we were out getting some fresh air and much-needed couple time. When we turned the corner onto our street, my heart dropped. A moving truck was parked in front of our house, and men were carrying out our furniture. "What the?" Alex's voice trailed off as we hurried toward the chaos. As we pushed through the front door, the sight that greeted us was like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Thompson and her daughter, Carol, were there, directing the movers with an air of authority that left no room for questions. "What in the world is going on here?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. Mrs. Thompson turned to us, a smirk playing on her lips. "Oh, Sarah, Alex, good, you're here. I've decided it's time I move back into my house." "Your house? We just spent months turning this place around, not to mention the money we poured into it." Alex's voice rose, his usual calm demeanor gone. Carol chimed in, her tone just as cold as her mother's. "Well, it's a family house, and we're family. It's only right we live here. Plus, think of how nice it'll be for my kids in that lovely nursery you fixed up." I felt like I was in a bad dream, the room spinning around me. "But you told us to move in here. You pushed for this. We have a baby on the way, for goodness sake." Mrs. Thompson shrugged, her gaze void of any sympathy. "Things change, dear. I needed a break, and you provided it. But now, it's time for you to go back to your little apartment." The reality of her words hit me like a tidal wave. All our work, all our dreams for this house, were being ripped away without a second thought. I glanced at Alex, his face a mask of shock and hurt. "Mom, you can't do this. We have rights. We'll fight this," he stammered, the fight in his voice not matching the defeat in his eyes. Mrs. Thompson laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. "Good luck with that. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a house to settle into." We were ushered out like strangers, our belongings piled haphazardly on the lawn. The movers didn't meet our eyes, their actions mechanical and detached. As we sat amidst boxes and bags, the life we had built within those walls now locked away from us, Alex put his arm around me. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I just never imagined." I leaned into him, the tears I'd been holding back finally breaking free. "It's not your fault, Alex. We were conned, plain and simple." The following days were a blur of anger, disbelief, and an unyielding sense of betrayal. We were back in our apartment, surrounded by boxes that were meant for a different life. Alex was quiet, his usual light extinguished by the shock. I was fuming, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "We need to do something, Alex. We can't let them get away with this," I exclaimed, my voice sharp with frustration. Alex, looking up from the sea of papers he had been sifting through, met my gaze. "I know, Sarah. And I think I have something that might help." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" He held up his phone, a determined glint in his eye. "Remember the day she proposed the switch?" I had recorded the conversation, just a gut feeling. It's all here, her admitting it was her house, but encouraging us to move in, to invest. I felt a surge of hope, mixed with a bitter satisfaction. That could be our leverage. We contacted a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Janet who had a reputation for being a bulldog in court. She listened intently as we relayed our story, the recording playing a pivotal role. "This is good," Janet nodded after hearing the recording. "It's not a straightforward case, but it's a start. We'll need more, though." receipts, contracts, any communication about the renovations. We spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence we could find. Every receipt felt like a tiny weapon in our fight to reclaim not just the house, but our dignity and future. The day we presented our case to Janet, her office was stark and uninviting, but her focus was unwavering. "This is solid," she said, sifting through the papers. "We'll file for deception and undue influence. It's going to be a battle, but I think we have a shot." The weeks leading up to the court date were tense. We were a mix of nerves and grim determination. The thought of facing Mrs. Thompson and Carol in court made my stomach churn. On the day, as we sat in the sterile courtroom, I held Alex's hand tightly. Mrs. Thompson and Carol sat across from us, their faces masks of cool indifference. As the proceedings began, Janet was fierce, laying out our case with a precision that left no room for doubt. Mrs. Thompson's lawyer tried to counter, but the recording, the receipts, they all painted a clear picture of deceit. When it was Mrs. Thompson's turn to speak, her voice was shaky, a stark contrast to the confident, almost smug tone she had used when kicking us out. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just needed some help, and I thought." "Thank you, no further questions." Janet cut her off, turning back to the judge with a nod. The rest of the trial was a blur of legal jargon and closing arguments. As we waited for the judge to deliver his verdict, I felt Alex's hand grip mine, his palm sweaty. The judge finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. "After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, I find in favor of the plaintiffs. It is clear that there was a calculated effort to mislead and benefit from their investments." Relief flooded through me, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Alex let out a long breath, his body sagging slightly. As we walked out of the courtroom, the world seemed a little brighter, a little more hopeful. "We did it," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Alex pulled me into a hug, right there on the courthouse steps. "We did," he agreed, his voice steady and sure. "And now, we move forward." The battle was over, but the war had left its scars. As we started the journey back to our apartment, the future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: we were stronger together, and no matter what came next, we would face it as a team. After the legal victory, the weight of the past months began to lift, but the task of truly moving on was still ahead of us. The first order of business was to clear out the house, our house, as the court had affirmed, at least in terms of the investment we'd made. Alex and I returned, not as residents, but as reclaimers of our peace and investment. We methodically removed every piece of furniture, every appliance, and even the fancy new plumbing fixtures we'd installed. Each item carried out was a chapter of our ordeal, closed and packed away. "I can't believe we're stripping the house bare," Alex said, his voice echoing in the now hollow space. "It's only what we put into it," I reminded him, my voice firm with a resolve that hadn't been there before. As we worked, Mrs. Thompson arrived, her eyes wide as she saw the shell of what had once been her home. She began to sob, her body shaking with each heave. "Please, I didn't mean for any of this. I'm so sorry. Can't we just forget all this happened?" she pleaded, her voice desperate. Alex and I exchanged a look, the shared pain and betrayal still fresh between us. "We're beyond sorry now," Alex said. "We're just doing what's fair." With the house emptied of our contributions, we also cut the financial cord that had bound us to Mrs. Thompson. The monthly checks we had been sending were no more. It was a hard decision, but necessary for us to truly start anew. The final blow to Mrs. Thompson's crumbling world came when she had to face the financial consequences of her actions. In order to reimburse us for the extensive and costly renovations, she was forced to sell the house. The place that had been a symbol of her deceit now had to be let go, the proceeds going towards paying us back. The news of the sale came to us not with joy but with a quiet acknowledgement of the closure it brought. We had no desire to revel in her downfall, we simply wanted to move forward. In the end, Mrs. Thompson stood in the doorway of what was once her home, now belonging to another family, her eyes red from tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered again, her voice lost in the shuffle of movers and the bustle of new occupants. We left her there, her apologies a faint echo in our determined stride away. Our path led back to our apartment, to the life we had been building before everything went awry. We walked hand in hand, not looking back. The apartment welcomed us with open arms, its walls ready to be filled with new memories and laughter. And as we settled back into the rhythm of our life, the nursery awaiting its occupant, we knew that we had come out of this stronger. We had fought for our future, for our family, and no matter what else lay ahead, we would face it together. Life has a funny way of smoothing out the edges after a storm. Our apartment, once a temporary shelter, had transformed back into a loving home. With the past finally behind us, Alex and I focused on the future, especially with our baby's arrival just around the corner. One evening, as I was arranging some baby clothes, Alex came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "You know, I can't wait to meet our little one. It's like the start of something amazing, isn't it?" he said, his voice warm and excited. I leaned back into his embrace, feeling the gentle kick from our unborn child. "It really is. After everything, this feels like we've been given a fresh start, a new chapter." We spent our evenings planning and dreaming, talking about the kind of parents we wanted to be, the things we wanted to teach our child. The nursery, once a source of contention, was now a haven of hope and anticipation, filled with soft colors and the gentle lullabies that floated from a music box. The day our daughter was born, the world seemed to stand still. She was perfect, a tiny bundle of joy that instantly became the center of our universe. Holding her for the first time, I felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed me. As we sat there, in the quiet of the nursery, the world outside continuing on, I realized that this was what true happiness felt like. It wasn't about the absence of conflict or the avoidance of challenges. It was about facing them head-on, together, and coming out the other side stronger and more united. I'm Zoe, a 28-year-old librarian with a past that reads more like a thriller than a quiet bookworm's life. I grew up in a neighborhood that taught me more about survival than any school could. I became a state champion in lightweight boxing and martial arts, not just for trophies, but to stand my ground. They called me Riptide back then, 'cause I was calm until I wasn't, and then I swept everything away. I remember the day I met Alex. It started like any other, with me shelving books and daydreaming between the quiet aisles of the library. But as I left work that day, some wannabe tough guys decided I was an easy target. That's when Alex stepped in, all chivalry and bravado. "Hey, leave her alone," he shouted, stepping between me and them. I rolled my eyes, knowing well I could handle it, but I appreciated the gesture. The thugs laughed. "What are you gonna do about it?" one sneered. Before I knew it, fists were flying. Alex took a hit, and that's when I stepped in. My training kicked in, and within minutes, the thugs were running away, nursing more than their pride. Alex was on the ground, nursing a busted lip. "Wow, that was amazing," he exclaimed, blood and awe mixing in his voice. "I'm Alex, by the way." "Zoe," I replied, offering him a hand up. From that day, we were inseparable. His parents welcomed me with open arms, his mother always saying, "You're the daughter I never had." His father would chuckle, "Well, she's certainly the protector we never knew we needed." But not everyone was a fan. Mark, Alex's younger brother, was different. The first time I met him, he sneered at my job. "A librarian, huh?" he scoffed. "What do you do, read all day?" I shrugged. "And keep the world of knowledge safe for the likes of you." He laughed, a harsh sound. "I prefer my women with a bit more edge." I raised an eyebrow. Trust me, I've got more edge than you can handle. We left it at that, an uneasy truce between us. But I could tell, this was just the beginning of our story, one that would challenge me in ways I never expected. I went home that night, the house quiet except for the sound of Alex cooking in the kitchen. The smell of spaghetti wafted through the air, a simple pleasure after a long day. You wouldn't believe the day I had. I started, but he turned, a smile wiping away any fatigue. Let me guess, another round with the encyclopedia set? Something like that, I laughed. We settled into our routine, a peaceful life punctuated by the echoes of my past. I didn't know then how much my old life would come crashing back into my new one, but for now, I was content. I had found a new beginning, a chance at a life I never thought I'd have. First Alex's father passed away, then his mother fell asleep and did not wake up. After the dust had settled with Alex's parents passing, we found ourselves navigating a new normal. They had left us a small, cozy house in a decent part of town, while Mark ended up with an apartment across the city. It seemed like things might calm down, but that was wishful thinking. I remember the day Mark showed up unannounced with his new wife, Lisa. She was a whirlwind of attitude and ink, her tattoos trailing down her arms like battle scars. I was in the middle of sorting through some old boxes when they barged in. "Hey, look what the cat dragged in," Mark announced with a smirk. Lisa stood behind him, chewing gum loudly, her eyes scanning the house like she owned the place. "Nice digs you got here," Lisa said, her voice dripping with a mix of admiration and disdain. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Thanks, we like it. And you are?" She laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "I'm Lisa, Mark's better half. And by better, I mean way better." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, Lisa, welcome to our home. Just try not to break anything, including Mark." Mark rolled his eyes. "Always the joker, huh, Zoe? But seriously, this place is way too nice for a couple of bookworms. You should see the dump we're in." Lisa chimed in. "Yeah, we were thinking, maybe we could swap, you know? You take the apartment, and we take this little paradise." Alex, who had been quiet until then, laughed. "I think we'll keep what's ours, thanks." The conversation was tense, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Lisa strutted around the house, her every move calculated to intimidate. But I wasn't one to back down. "Listen, Lisa," I started, my voice steady. "This is our home, and you're welcome as family, but don't overstep. We all got to live our own lives." She snapped her gum and stared me down. "Oh, I'm just getting started, honey. I like a challenge, and this place," she gestured around, "is going to be mine." The audacity was almost laughable. Almost. I exchanged a look with Alex, who shook his head slightly, a silent message to let it go for now. They didn't stay long after that, but the tension lingered like a bad smell. After they left, Alex and I sat down in the living room, the silence between us heavy. "Can you believe them?" I finally said, breaking the quiet. Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mark's always been a handful, but Lisa, she's something else." "I can handle her," I said, more to myself than to him. "I've dealt with worse." But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, that encounter marked the beginning of a series of events that would test our patience and our resolve. Lisa's bold claim on our home wasn't just idle talk. It was a declaration of war, and we were right in the crosshairs. The trouble began in small, annoying ways at first. I'd wake up to find trash thrown over our fence or nasty words spray-painted on the side of the house. "Get out," they'd say, or "not welcome." It was juvenile, but it set me on edge. I had a feeling Lisa was behind it, a suspicion that was confirmed when things escalated. One morning, I found a dead bird lying on our doorstep, a twisted warning. I remember standing there, staring down at it, the anger boiling inside me. I scooped it up with a shovel, my mind racing with dark thoughts. I decided to let it slide for the moment, but then Lisa took it a step further. She came strutting into the library one afternoon, a smug look on her face. I was reshelving books, and she made a beeline straight for me. "Hey, book nerd," she called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. I turned, keeping my face neutral. "Can I help you?" She smirked, her eyes glinting with malice. "Just wanted to see where the famous Zoe spends her days. Quite the boring life you've got here, huh?" I shrugged, trying to keep it cool. "It's a living." "What do you want, Lisa?" She leaned in close, her breath reeking of cigarettes. "Just a friendly visit. But let me give you a little advice. Give up the house, and all this," she gestured around, "stops. Simple as that." Before I could reply, she started knocking books off the shelves, her laughter echoing in the quiet room. I grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Enough, Lisa. Leave now, or I'll call the cops." She yanked her arm free, still smirking. "You wouldn't dare." "See you around, Zoe." I spent the next hour picking up books, my mind a whirlwind of anger and frustration. I wanted to fight back, to put her in her place, but I remembered my promise to stay calm. I couldn't let her see she got to me. That evening, I called Mark, hoping maybe he'd see reason. "Mark, your wife's out of control. She came into the library today, caused a scene. It's got to stop," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, and then he laughed. Zoe, always so dramatic. Lisa's just having a bit of fun. But I'll tell you what, you give us the house, and I'll make sure she leaves you alone." I clenched my fist, feeling the old fire rise. "That's not going to happen, Mark. Control your wife, or I'll take matters into my own hands." He scoffed. "Big words, Zoe. Just remember, you started this." We hung up, the threat hanging heavy in the air. I didn't tell Alex about the call, not wanting to worry him more than necessary. But I knew things were about to get a lot worse. It was only a matter of time before Lisa or Mark made their next move, and I had to be ready. The tension was like a thick fog, hanging over our home and seeping into every corner. I could feel it, a constant reminder that things were far from okay. It wasn't just the vandalism or the threats anymore. It was the waiting, the not knowing when or what would come next. One evening, as I walked home from the library, my nerves were on high alert. The streets were unusually quiet, the silence amplifying my anxiety. That's when I saw him, Mark, staggering down the sidewalk towards me, a bottle in one hand and a look of drunken fury on his face. "Hey, Zoe," he slurred, his words soaked in alcohol. "Thought you could ignore me, huh?" I stopped, my heart pounding. "Mark, go home. You're drunk." He sneered, taking a step closer. "This is my family's home you're living in. You don't belong here." Before I could react, he swung at me, his fist cutting through the air. Instinct took over. I dodged his blow and grabbed his arm, twisting it behind him. He yelped in pain, his knees buckling. "Listen to me, Mark," I hissed, my voice low and steady. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will defend myself." He struggled, trying to break free, but I held firm. "You're nothing, Zoe. A nobody." With a quick movement, I pushed him to the ground, his body hitting the pavement with a thud. He lay there, whimpering, the fight gone out of him. "Stay away from us, Mark," I warned, my voice cold. "Next time, I won't be so gentle." I left him there, the night swallowing his curses and threats. As I walked the rest of the way home, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. It was one thing to deal with words and petty acts of vandalism, but this was different. Mark had crossed a line, and I knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated even further. Alex was waiting for me when I got home, his face etched with concern. "Where have you been? I've been worried sick." I sighed, the weight of the evening pressing down on me. Ran into Mark. It got a little heated. Alex's eyes widened. "What happened?" Are you okay? I nodded, trying to reassure him. I'm fine. Just tired of all this, tired of being pushed around. He wrapped his arms around me, a silent promise of support. We'll figure this out, Zoe. Together. But as we stood there, clinging to each other, I couldn't shake the feeling that our troubles were far from over. I had reached my breaking point, and there was no turning back. I was ready to do whatever it took to protect our home, to protect our peace. And if that meant facing down the demons of my past, then so be it. I was no stranger to fighting, and I wasn't about to start backing down now. The days that followed were a blur of unease and whispered conversations. The incident with Mark had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. I knew I had to tell Alex everything, but part of me dreaded his reaction. Would he see me differently, knowing the full extent of the violence I was capable of? When Alex finally came home from his trip, I was a bundle of nerves. He looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than when he left. He dropped his bags and pulled me into a hug, a silent question in his embrace. Zoe, what's wrong? He asked, his voice laced with worry. You're shaking. I took a deep breath, the words tumbling out. It's Mark and Lisa. They've been terrorizing us, and it's getting worse. His brow furrowed, confusion and anger mixing in his eyes. What do you mean? What happened? I told him everything, from the dead bird to the confrontation with Mark. With each word, I saw the shock and hurt flash across his face. You've been dealing with this alone? Why didn't you tell me? Alex's voice cracked, a mix of anger and concern. I didn't want to worry you, and I thought I could handle it, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Zoe, we're in this together. You don't have to carry this burden alone. I nodded, the guilt and relief swirling inside me. I know. I'm sorry. I didn't want you to see this side of me. The side that fights, that hurts people. Alex took my hand, his grip firm. I married you for all of you, Zoe. Your strength, your courage, it's part of who you are. And I love you for it. We talked late into the night, making plans and discussing our options. But underneath the strategy and determination, there was an unspoken fear. What if it wasn't enough? What if Lisa and Mark didn't back down? The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Alex on the phone, his voice low and urgent. I walked into the kitchen, catching snippets of his conversation. Can't go on like this. We need to take action, he was saying. I'll call the lawyer, see what our options are. He hung up and turned to me, a determined look on his face. We're going to fight this, Zoe. Legally, and if necessary, we'll take other precautions. But we're not letting them win. I nodded, the fighter in me rising to the surface. I'm with you, Alex. Whatever it takes. But even as we banded together, ready to defend our home, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Confessing to Alex had lifted a weight off my shoulders, but it also made the threat more real. This was no longer a distant danger, it was at our doorstep, and we were about to face it head-on. The battle lines were drawn, and there was no turning back. The quiet life we had built was about to be tested, and I only hoped that our love and resolve would be enough to see us through. One brisk morning, as Alex and I were enjoying a rare moment of quiet, a loud knock shattered the peace. We exchanged a wary glance before I opened the door. There stood Mark and Lisa, flanked by a group of guys with a rough, gangster edge. Lisa's smug grin told me everything I needed to know. This was her latest attempt to intimidate us, to scare us into giving up our home. Look what we brought you, Lisa taunted, gesturing to the menacing crowd behind her. I felt Alex stiffen beside me, but I kept my cool. This isn't going to work, Lisa. You can't bully us out of our own home. That's when the unexpected happened. The apparent leader of the group, a broad-shouldered guy with a commanding presence, stepped forward and burst out laughing. It wasn't the reaction any of us were expecting, least of all me. Zoe? Is that really you? He exclaimed, his laughter subsiding into a wide grin. I squinted, taking in his features, a flicker of recognition igniting in my mind. Danny? Danny Coleman? The rest of the group looked on in confusion as Danny nodded, still grinning. In the flesh. Can't believe it's you, Riptide. The old nickname sent a shockwave through the crowd. I saw the change in their eyes, the way their posture shifted from hostile to respectful. Lisa and Mark were visibly taken aback, the confidence draining from their faces. Danny turned to the group, his voice loud and clear. Folks, you might not know this, but Zoe here is a legend. We grew up in the same neighborhood, saw her fights. Trust me when I say, she's not someone you want to mess with. The murmurs of acknowledgement and nods of respect were almost surreal. Here I was, facing a potentially dangerous situation, and suddenly I had an advocate in the most unexpected form, a former classmate turned gang leader. Danny addressed Lisa and Mark directly, his tone serious. You two got it all wrong. Trying to bully Zoe out of her house? That's not going to fly, not with me here. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper, her bravado gone. But, this is supposed to be our house. We deserve it. Danny shook his head, the finality in his motion clear. You don't deserve anything by terrorizing people, especially not someone like Zoe. He turned back to me, his expression softening. Look, I know we've had our differences in the past, but no one messes with you. Not on my watch. As they left, with Lisa and Mark trailing behind, a defeated duo, the neighborhood's silence returned. But it was a different kind of quiet now, one filled with newfound respect and an unexpected sense of security. I closed the door, leaning back against it, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. Alex wrapped his arms around me, a mix of shock and relief on his face. I can't believe that just happened. I smiled, the tension finally releasing. Neither can I. But I'm not complaining. We had faced down a threat with the most unlikely of outcomes. As I looked out the window at the retreating figures, I realized that sometimes, the past doesn't just haunt you, it comes back to lend a helping hand. And with that thought, I knew we were going to be okay. We had stood our ground, and we had won. After the standoff with Danny and his crew, things took a swift turn. The air around our little home was charged with a sense of change, a palpable shift in the winds that had been threatening our peace for so long. The first sign of this change came unexpectedly, just a few days later. I was out in the garden, tending to the roses that had started to bloom again, when I saw Lisa, her usual brashness replaced with a hunched, defeated posture. She was alone, without Mark or any of her so-called friends. She barely glanced my way as she made her way to her car, piled with boxes and bags. It was clear, she was leaving. The news spread quickly. Danny, the unexpected ally from my past, had made good on his word. He kicked Lisa out of the gang, severing her last ties to the community she'd tried to dominate. Without the backing of her tough friends, Lisa no longer felt safe or powerful in the city. Her departure was quiet, almost unnoticed, a stark contrast to the loud, defiant character she had always portrayed. Mark was next. He came by a few days after Lisa's departure, his car filled with the last of his belongings. He stopped by our house, a hesitant figure at the end of our driveway. I went out to meet him, curious about what he had to say. Zoe, he started, avoiding my eyes. I'm leaving too. Sold the apartment. It's time for a fresh start, somewhere far from here. His voice was soft, lacking the harsh, mocking tone I'd grown used to. I could see the toll the recent events had taken on him, the realization of his mistakes finally dawning on him. Mark? I said, my tone neutral. I hope you find what you're looking for. And I hope you learn from all this. He nodded, a small acknowledgement of the chaos he'd helped create. I'm sorry, Zoe, for all the trouble. I was wrong. With that, He got into his car and drove away, leaving behind the neighborhood, the conflicts, and a trail of regrets. The street that had once felt like a battleground was quiet again, the tumultuous chapter of our lives coming to a close. Inside, Alex and I watched from the window, a sense of surreal relief washing over us. "They're gone," I said, almost in disbelief. "Just like that." Alex wrapped his arm around my shoulder, pulling me close. "It's over," he whispered. "We can start to move on now." As we looked out at the quiet street, the setting sun casting long shadows over the houses, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected turn of fate that had led us here. The day Lisa and Mark left, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. It was as if the air itself was lighter, fresher, and filled with new possibilities. Alex and I found ourselves in a surreal kind of calm, the kind you only notice once the constant noise has gone. One evening, as we sat on our front porch, the last rays of the sun dipping below the horizon, I broke the comfortable silence between us. "Can you believe it's over?" I asked, my voice a mixture of wonder and relief. Alex looked over, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "Honestly, no. It feels like we've woken up from a bad dream." I chuckled, the sound more heartfelt than it had been in months. "A really bad dream. But, hey, we're awake now." With each passing day, the dark chapter of Lisa and Mark faded more into the background. Our home felt like a sanctuary again, a place filled with love and laughter, rather than tension and fear. I returned to my routine, finding solace in the simple tasks of gardening and reading, the library a haven of quiet stability. The simple pleasures of neighborhood life, once overshadowed by fear and conflict, now shone brightly. Evening walks, chats over the fence, the shared experiences of community life, they all took on a new significance. The path had been long and fraught with challenges, but we had emerged stronger, our bonds with each other and with our community deepened. The peace that now filled our home was not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding, resilience, and love. I'm Lily, a 32-year-old woman who believed in the warmth of love and the promise of a shared future. My husband, Ethan, was once the sun in my sky, but over the years, his light has dimmed, leaving me in a growing chill of neglect and harsh words. It started subtly, a missed dinner here, a harsh word there. But then it became our norm. His once tender glances turned cold, and his touches, which used to spark joy, became rare and perfunctory. One particularly cold evening, I was attempting to bridge the distance that had formed between us, setting up a nice dinner hoping to recapture some of our old warmth. "Ethan, dinner's ready," I called out, trying to inject some cheer into my voice. He walked in, his eyes scanning the table, not a flicker of appreciation in his gaze. "You know I don't like salmon," he muttered, his words clipped. "But you used to love it," I replied, the hurt clear in my voice. He shrugged, dismissing my effort and the memories attached to it. "That was then. Can't you do anything right, Lily?" His words stung, each one a reminder of how far we drifted. I bit my lip, holding back tears, as I watched him eat in silence, his indifference a stark contrast to the love-filled meals we once shared. After dinner, as I was cleaning up, the weight of his growing disdain and blame became too much to bear silently. "Why do you treat me this way, Ethan? What happened to us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He scoffed, standing up to leave the room. "Maybe if you weren't so barren, things would be different. You're just not enough, Lily. Not as a wife, not as a woman." His cruel words echoed in the now empty room, each syllable etched painfully into my heart. I was left alone, with the remnants of a dinner that tasted of lost love and broken dreams. That night, as I lay in bed, Ethan's presence beside me felt like miles apart. I turned away, my silent tears a testament to the cold shift that had taken over our lives. It was clear that I was alone in my pain, my longing for a child turned into a weapon of blame and shame. The next day, I confided in my diary, the only place I felt safe to express my deepest fears and sorrows. "He doesn't see me anymore, doesn't hear me. I'm just a shadow in my own home, a ghost of the woman I used to be. The evening of the family dinner arrived with a tension I could almost taste. Ethan's parents, Mary and George, had always treated me with kindness, a stark contrast to their son's recent coldness. As we gathered around the dining table, the air was filled with the clinking of cutlery and the simmering undercurrent of unspoken issues. George, ever the patriarch, raised his glass to toast. To family, he declared with a warm smile. To family, we echoed, our voices a chorus of varying emotions. As the dinner progressed, the conversation drifted to the topic I dreaded most, children. George, with his usual bluntness, broached the subject. For years, Ethan, Lily. We were hoping for a grandchild to spoil by now. Ethan's mother, Mary, chimed in, her voice gentle yet firm. Perhaps it's time to consider seeing a specialist. There could be many reasons for not conceiving, and it's best to understand them. I felt Ethan's gaze on me, his eyes like ice. We know the reason, don't we, Lily? It's her, he said, his voice dripping with accusation. The word stung, more so under the concerned gaze of his parents. It's not just about me, Ethan. It takes two, you know, I replied, my voice steady but my hands trembling under the table. Mary, with her medical background, sensed the tension. Then it's settled. Both of you will go for a checkup. It's the only way to know for sure, she stated, a note of finality in her voice. Ethan laughed, a hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. Sure, we'll go. But we already know the answer, don't we? Later that evening, as Ethan and I cleaned up in silence, the weight of the situation bore down on me. The idea of the medical examinations loomed large, a beacon of hope and a source of dread all at once. Ethan, I started, breaking the silence, I'm scared. What if there's really something wrong with me? He didn't look at me, his focus on the dishes in the sink. Then we'll know, won't we? Better than living in denial. His words were meant to be dismissive, but I caught the flicker of something else in his voice. Fear? Uncertainty? It was hard to tell. As I went to bed that night, the house felt colder than ever. The uncertainty of the coming days was a heavy blanket, smothering the last embers of warmth between us. Yet, despite everything, a part of me clung to the hope that the tests might lead to a solution, a way forward out of this stagnant bitterness. The days following our medical examinations were some of the longest of my life. As I awaited the results, my thoughts constantly circled back to what they might reveal, to the myriad of ways they could impact our already strained relationship. Ethan, however, seemed more irritable than anxious, his patience wearing thinner with each passing day. One afternoon, as I sat lost in thought, Ethan stormed into the room, his face twisted with annoyance. Look at this place, Lily. It's a mess. You're so caught up in your own head, you've let the house go. Before I could respond, he grabbed my hand and practically dragged me into his office. Start here. I want every surface clean, especially my desk. I can't work in this filth. His words stung, but I bit my tongue and began to clean, my motions mechanical as I tried to suppress the hurt and confusion swirling inside me. As I moved to dust his desk, my hand accidentally caught the edge of a folder, sending it tumbling to the floor, papers spilling out in a chaotic cascade. I knelt to gather them, apologizing under my breath, but as I started to put them back, my eyes caught on the contents. There were medical insurance papers, hospital receipts for childbirth, all paid for by Ethan. A name I didn't recognize, likely the mother, was listed, along with a date not too far in the past. The truth hit me like a physical blow, Ethan had a child with another woman. My heart pounded, a mix of shock, betrayal, and a deep, searing pain coursing through me. But I knew I couldn't confront him, not yet. I needed to be smart, to gather evidence and plan my next steps carefully. Once I was sure Ethan was occupied elsewhere, I quickly copied all the documents, my hands shaking as I worked. Each copy was a silent confirmation of the lies and deceit that had infiltrated our marriage, of the double life Ethan had been leading right under my nose. As I tucked the copies away in a safe place, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The hurt was still there, a dull, persistent ache, but it was now accompanied by a clarity of purpose. I wouldn't let Ethan get away with this betrayal. I would bide my time, wait for the right moment to reveal everything. For the rest of the day, I moved through the house like a shadow, performing my chores with a mechanical efficiency. Ethan remained oblivious, wrapped up in his own affairs, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. That night, as I lay in bed, Ethan's breathing steady and even beside me, I couldn't help but wonder how many other nights he'd shared with another, how many lies he'd told to cover his tracks. The pain was almost unbearable, but it was also a catalyst, transforming my sadness and despair into a quiet, burning resolve. I didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was clear: I wouldn't be the silent, suffering wife any longer. I would confront Ethan, confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The wait for the examination results was still there, a looming question mark in our lives, but it was no longer the only thing defining my existence. I had a plan, a purpose, and I would see it through to the end. No more waiting, no more wondering. It was time to act. As Ethan's birthday unfolded, the house buzzed with the hum of conversation and laughter, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within me. I circulated among the guests, a smile plastered on my face, my heart racing with the anticipation of the revelation to come. When it was time for Ethan to open his gifts, the room filled with the rustle of wrapping paper and appreciative murmurs. Finally, it was my turn. I handed him a neatly wrapped box, my hand steady, my resolve firm. "Happy birthday, Ethan," I said, my voice betraying none of my inner turmoil. He accepted it with a confident smirk, perhaps expecting something mundane, something that would affirm the facade of our marriage. But as he lifted the lid and his eyes scanned the contents, his expression morphed from smug assurance to utter shock. "What's this?" he stammered, his voice faltering as he held up the documents for the room to see. "It's the truth," I said simply, standing firm amidst the sudden wave of tension that swept through the room. The guests leaned in, a collective intake of breath filling the space as they tried to make sense of the scene unfolding before them. Ethan's mother, Mary, took the papers from his trembling hands, her eyes widening as she read the details spelled out on the page. "Ethan, is this true? Do you have a child with another woman?" Her voice was a mix of disbelief and rising anger. Ethan's face turned pale, his usual composure shattered. "It's not how it looks, I can explain." He fumbled with the papers, his gaze darting around the room, desperately seeking an ally. But there was no respite to be found. The guests murmured among themselves, the air thick with judgment and shock. Ethan's father, George, stood up, his face a mask of disappointment and rage. "Explain? How could you do this, not just to Lily, but to all of us? We're your family." His voice boomed, cutting through the whispers like a knife. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked around at the faces of friends and family, at the disillusionment and accusation reflected back at him. The room, once filled with the warmth of celebration, now felt cold, the air heavy with betrayal. I watched him, feeling a mixture of vindication and sorrow. "Everyone, I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but I thought it was time the truth came out," I said, addressing the room. The guests remained in place, the celebration forgotten, as the gravity of the situation settled upon us all. No one moved to leave, the shock of the revelation rooting them to the spot. The festive atmosphere had been irrevocably tainted, the joy of the occasion turned to ash. Ethan looked around, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment, I saw the realization of the consequences of his actions dawn upon him. The room stayed silent, the tension palpable, as we all waited for what would come next. The revelation had been made, and now, there was no turning back. As the room's shock over the initial revelation began to settle, I knew it was time to deliver the final blow. Ethan, pale and shaken from the fallout of his exposed secrets, was still grasping at strangled threads of dignity when I stepped forward, holding another set of documents. "Ethan," I began, my voice clear and unwavering, "there's more you need to know." I handed him the envelope containing the medical results we'd both been anxiously awaiting. The room, already thick with tension, seemed to hold its breath as Ethan's hands trembled slightly while opening it. His eyes scanned the contents, and the color completely drained from his face, leaving him ghostly pale. "What is it, Ethan? What does it say?" his mother, Mary, demanded, her voice sharp with concern and growing anger. He couldn't speak, couldn't even lift his gaze from the paper that spelled out a truth so ironic it was almost poetic. He was the one who was infertile. I spoke up, filling the heavy silence. "The tests show that Ethan is infertile. It's not me who's been unable to conceive." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Whispers erupted among the guests, a mix of sympathy for me and disbelief at Ethan's situation. His parents, Mary and George, looked from the papers to their son with expressions that morphed from shock to anger. "Infertile? But you blamed Lily all this time." Mary's voice cracked, her disappointment palpable. George stood, his disappointment hardening into a cold fury. "You've not only been unfaithful and lied to us all, but you dared to shame and blame Lily for something that was your own issue." The accusations flew, thick and fast, each one landing like a blow. Ethan's facade of control shattered completely, leaving behind a man I barely recognized. He was no longer the confident, sometimes arrogant person I had married. Instead, he was small, exposed, and undeniably alone. "But I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper against the storm of condemnation. "It doesn't matter if you knew or not," George boomed, his voice resonating with finality. "You've deceived everyone here, most of all Lily." The room buzzed with the weight of betrayal and deceit. Ethan's life, once so orderly and controlled, was unraveling before our very eyes. His once loving parents now looked at him with eyes filled with something akin to strangers' disdain. As the room processed the news, Ethan's mother, Mary, turned to him with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Ethan, if you're infertile, then who is the father of your mistress's child?" The question hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Ethan's shock was apparent, his face contorting into an expression of disbelief and betrayal. I don't know. I never considered she might be cheating on me too." The admission sent a ripple through the room, the guests exchanging looks of disbelief and pity. George, Ethan's father, stood up, his stature commanding the attention of everyone present. "You've been deceived, son, just as you've deceived us all. It's a bitter irony that's hard to swallow." The accusations continued to fly, each word a nail in the coffin of Ethan's once neatly arranged life. His parents, once his staunchest supporters, now looked at him with eyes filled with disappointment and a deep, unspoken sadness. They had lost a grandson they thought they had and were now grappling with the reality of their son's deceit and the complexities of his betrayal. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Ethan seemed to crumble, his usual arrogance and control evaporating into the charged air of the room. I need to figure this out. I need to understand what's happened," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The guests began to leave, the atmosphere too charged with anger and disillusionment to bear. Ethan's parents remained, their expressions grim and thoughtful, a stark contrast to the joy and celebration that had marked the beginning of the evening. The room emptied until it was just Ethan, his parents, and me. The silence that followed was a testament to the broken relationships and trust that lay in tatters around us. Ethan's world had come crashing down, and as he sat there, head in his hands, it was clear that the journey ahead would be a difficult one, filled with introspection, legal battles, and the daunting task of rebuilding his shattered life. For me, the revelation of the medical results was a vindication of sorts, but it was also a reminder of the complex web of lies and deceit that had ensnared us all. As I looked around the room, at the faces of those I had once considered family, I knew that while this chapter was closing, the story was far from over. There were questions to be answered, wounds to heal, and a new path to forge. The tables had turned, indeed, but the full extent of the fallout was yet to be realized. The dust had barely settled after the revelations of Ethan's birthday when I found myself navigating the aftermath of our shattered marriage. The house, once filled with shared dreams and laughter, now echoed with the heavy silence of our broken vows. Ethan, a mere shadow of the man I once knew, tried to approach me the morning after, his eyes rimmed with red, a mix of sleeplessness and perhaps regret. Lily, he started, his voice hoarse. I don't even know what to say. What is there to say, Ethan? I replied, my voice steady, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside. The truth is out. There's no taking it back. He ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture that now seemed foreign. I know I've messed up, more than I can ever fix. But I was scared, Lily. Scared of what it meant to be infertile, to not be able to give us, what we wanted. I sighed, feeling the weight of his words, yet unable to fully comprehend the depth of his deceit. Being scared doesn't excuse your actions, Ethan. You lied, you cheated, and you hurt everyone around you, especially me. He nodded, the fight seemingly gone from him. I know. And I'll do whatever it takes to make it right, if not for us, then for my own conscience. The room grew quiet, the air between us thick with unsaid words and unresolved pain. I knew that the path ahead was one I would have to walk alone, the trust and love we once shared now just remnants of a past life. In the days that followed, I took action. I met with lawyers, collected the necessary documents, and filed for divorce. Each step felt like a liberation, a reclaiming of the dignity and respect I had lost in the shadow of Ethan's betrayal. The legal proceedings were a blur, a series of meetings and signatures that dissolved the life we had built together. Ethan didn't fight it, his compliance a small solace in the storm of our separation. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, the final papers in hand, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. My marriage was over, the dreams we shared irreparably damaged. Yet, I also felt a spark of hope, a sense that from the ashes of this ordeal, a new, stronger Lily was emerging. The community, once so integral to our lives, watched from a distance, their whispers and pitying glances a constant reminder of the scandal that had unfolded. But among the murmurs, I also found support, friends and neighbors reaching out with offers of help and words of encouragement. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden, the sun warming my face, Mary came to visit. Her eyes were kind, but I saw the hurt that still lingered there. Lily, I just want you to know, we don't blame you. You've handled this with more grace than anyone could expect, she said, taking my hand in hers. I looked at her, the woman who had been like a mother to me, and felt a pang of shared loss. Thank you, Mary. I just wish things could have been different. She squeezed my hand, a silent acknowledgement of the complex tangle of emotions that surrounded us. You'll always be part of this family, Lily. No matter what. The conversation lingered in the air long after she left, a bittersweet reminder of the ties that still bound me to the life I was leaving behind. As I packed up my belongings, each object a memory of the life Ethan and I had shared, I realized that this wasn't just an end, it was also a beginning. A chance to rebuild, to rediscover who I was outside the shadow of my marriage. And as I turned the key in the lock one last time, leaving behind the house that had been my home, I knew that this wasn't just a farewell. It was a declaration of independence, a first step into a future that, while uncertain, was entirely my own. The finality of signing the divorce papers was both liberating and somber. I had filed for divorce from Ethan, demanding compensation for the emotional turmoil and betrayal he caused. My lawyer, a competent and empathetic woman, assured me that the evidence I gathered made a strong case for a substantial settlement. Ethan, on the other hand, found himself entangled not only in our divorce but also in a legal battle with the mistress who had deceived him. He had spent a fortune on medical expenses and supporting the child he believed was his, only to discover the web of lies that had ensnared him. Now, he was suing her, trying to recoup some of his losses and salvage what little dignity he had left. I watched from a distance as Ethan's once controlled and proud life unraveled. There was no joy in seeing him brought so low, but neither was there pity. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. The man I once loved had become a stranger, one whose fate no longer stirred any emotion in me other than a detached acknowledgement that justice, in its own way, was being served. As for me, I was busy building a new life. The settlement from the divorce provided a financial cushion that allowed me some peace of mind. I moved into a new place, smaller and cozier than the house I shared with Ethan, a place that quickly started to feel like home. It was my sanctuary, filled with my things, decorated to my taste, a visual representation of my newfound independence. I often sat in my new living room, a cup of tea in hand, reflecting on the tumultuous journey I had undergone. The tears and heartache felt like a distant memory, and in their place was a growing sense of self-awareness and strength. I had survived the worst of storms, and now relished the calm that followed. Friends and family were a constant source of support, their love and care helping to mend the parts of me that were broken by Ethan's betrayal. They cheered me on as I took the first tentative steps into a future that was entirely my own, unshaded by the expectations or failings of another. In the end, I found that I didn't need revenge or to see Ethan suffer. My greatest triumph was in reclaiming my life, in proving to myself that I could move past the pain and emerge stronger and more resilient. The wounds he inflicted would always be part of my story, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they were a testament to my ability to overcome and to thrive despite the odds. As I closed this chapter of my life, I felt a profound sense of closure and optimism. The journey ahead was mine alone, filled with opportunities and experiences waiting to be discovered. And as I stepped out each day, I did so with a lighter heart and a certainty that no matter what the future held, I was ready for it, stronger and wiser than ever before. Ethan was a chapter closed, a lesson learned, and now it was time to write new stories, ones filled with hope, growth, and the promise of a better tomorrow. In the quiet of our home, the memories of Amy, our only daughter, echoed off the walls. She was always more firecracker than flower, pushing boundaries and testing limits. As a dentist, I've seen my share of pain, but nothing quite compares to the ache of a child pulling away. My husband, John, a seasoned cop, always had a way of smoothing things over, but even he was at a loss when Amy packed up and left with that rock musician, her teenage rebellion reaching its peak. "John, how did we get here?" I asked one evening, staring at the empty chair Amy once occupied at our dinner table. One day she's sneaking out to concerts, the next, she's gone without a trace. John sighed, his eyes heavy with the same unsaid questions. "She's always been wild, Martha. Like a storm, you can't predict or tame it. But she's still our girl." But as days turned into months, with nothing but silence from Amy, the weight of her absence grew heavier. It wasn't until a photograph landed in our mailbox that we saw her again, not in person, but in a wedding picture, looking defiantly happy next to a man with a guitar and tattoos. No invitation, no call, just a snapshot of the life she chose over us. I remember my hands shaking as I held the photo, the hurt a tangible thing between us. "Look at her, John." Not even a note, just this picture. "She's made her choice, hasn't she?" John, ever the rock, tried to calm the storm brewing in me. "Maybe she's trying to reach out in her own way, Martha. It's a start, right?" But his words did little to soothe the sting of rejection. We continued on, our home feeling larger and lonelier by the day. Work was a distraction, patients and procedures filling the void left by Amy's laughter and chaos. Months had worn into a year with no word from Amy, and just when the silence seemed permanent, our computer pinged a Skype call. It was Amy, her face filling the screen, looking so different yet painfully familiar. "Mom, Dad, I need your help," she said, the edges of her voice ragged with wear. John and I exchanged a glance, the kind that speaks volumes without a word. "Amy, what's going on?" I asked, my heart hammering against my chest. She hesitated, her eyes darting away before locking back onto the screen. It's a lot. I've got a baby now, a little girl. And things, well, they aren't great. I need money, Mom, $1,000 a month." John's brow furrowed, his cop instincts on alert. "A grandkid? Amy, slow down. Why do you need the money?" She bit her lip, a nervous habit from childhood. "I just do, Dad. Please, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious." We sat in silence, the weight of her plea hanging heavy. Finally, I nodded, my decision firm despite the whirlwind of questions. All right, Amy. We'll help. But please, talk to us. What's been happening? She looked down, a tear tracing her cheek. I can't. Not now. Just, thank you. This means everything. The call ended abruptly, leaving John and I staring at a blank screen. What do you think, John? Did we just make a mistake? I murmured, the doubt creeping in. He shook his head, his hand finding mine. No, Martha. She's our daughter, and she's in trouble. It's our job to help, no questions asked. But a grandchild, John. A whole year, and she's kept this from us. What else don't we know? I couldn't keep the tremble from my voice. We'll find out, love. For now, let's just be there for her. However she'll let us, he replied, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. The days that followed were a blur of bank transfers and uneasy silence. I kept busy, the clinic a welcome distraction, but every time I came home, I half expected Amy to be there, waiting with her child. But the house remained quiet, our lives suspended in a state of waiting and worry. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the air thick with unsaid fears, John broke the silence. She'll reach out again, Martha. When she's ready. I nodded, clinging to his optimism like a lifeline. I hope you're right. I want to hold my grandchild, to tell Amy it's going to be okay. We will, love. We will, he assured me, though I saw the shadow of his own doubts flickering in his eyes. I whispered a silent prayer for my daughter and granddaughter, wherever they were. The plea had opened old wounds and new fears, but it had also rekindled a flame of hope. We were still a family, fractured and distant, but connected by unbreakable bonds of love and the unwavering promise to be there for each other, no matter what. It was one of those early mornings, when the cold bites at your bones, the world outside frosted and still. John and I were nestled in the warmth of our home, sipping coffee, the silence comfortable, if not a bit heavy with unspoken thoughts about Amy. That's when the sharp knock came, shattering the calm like a stone through glass. John and I exchanged a startled look, the same question in our eyes, who could it be at this hour? He stood up, moving towards the door, while I followed close behind, a knot of worry tightening in my stomach. He swung the door open and there, on our doorstep, was a sight that knocked the breath from me. Amy, thinner and more worn than I remembered, clutching a small bundle wrapped in blankets. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying, met mine, and it was as if the years of silence fell away in an instant. Amy? Oh my God, Amy! I cried out, rushing forward to wrap her in an embrace, the cold forgotten. Mom, Dad. I'm so sorry. Can we come in? Her voice was a whisper, hoarse and fragile. Of course, come in. John's voice was firm, guiding her gently inside as I quickly shut the door against the cold. Once inside, Amy unwrapped the bundle, revealing a tiny, sleeping face, peaceful despite the chaos. This is your granddaughter, she said, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down my face as I looked at the baby, so innocent and unaware of the storm she'd been born into. She's beautiful, Amy. What's her name? Amy hesitated, a shadow crossing her face. Lily. Her name's Lily. John, ever the practical one, sprung into action. You both look frozen. Martha, let's get them warmed up. I'll make some food. As I helped Amy out of her coat, the threadbare fabric and worn shoes didn't escape my notice. She was shivering, her body frail and tired. I ushered her to the living room, piling blankets around her and the baby. John brought in food, setting it before Amy, who ate with a hunger that spoke of too many missed meals. Lily, now awake, watched with wide, curious eyes, her little hand wrapped around my finger. Once Amy had eaten her fill, she looked up at us, her eyes holding a depth of pain and regret. I need to tell you everything. It's been so bad, worse than you can imagine. John and I sat, our hearts heavy with dread and love, ready to listen. As she spoke, her voice trembled with the weight of her story, each word painting a picture of a life unraveled, of dreams turned to nightmares. When she finally finished, the room was heavy with silence. I reached out, taking her hand in mine. "Amy, we're here now. You're safe, both of you." John nodded, his face set in a determined line. "We'll take care of you. Whatever it takes." Amy broke down then, tears streaming down her face, a mix of relief and sorrow. "I'm so sorry. I was so stupid, so proud. I should have come back sooner." I pulled her into a hug, rocking her gently. "Shoo, it's okay. You're home now. We'll fix this, together." Once Amy had settled a bit, Lily sleeping soundly in a makeshift bed we'd cobbled together, she began to unravel the story we'd been missing. John and I sat across from her, our hearts heavy, bracing ourselves for what was to come. "Mom, Dad, I don't even know where to start. Everything's been a mess since the day I left with him," Amy began, her fingers twisting a loose thread on the blanket. "Just start from the beginning, sweetheart. We're here to listen," I urged gently, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Amy took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the sleeping form of Lily. "It was all good at first, you know? Exciting, even. But then, after we got married, things changed. He changed. The music gigs dried up, and he started drinking, a lot. And then..." Her voice trailed off, a shiver running through her. John leaned forward, his face a mask of concern. "And then what, Amy?" She looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. "Then he started getting angry, at everything. At me. It wasn't long before he started hitting me." A sharp gasp escaped my lips, my hand flying to my mouth. John's jaw clenched, his hands forming fists on his knees. "That bastard," he muttered under his breath. Amy continued, the words pouring out now, a floodgate opened. "I thought I could handle it, that I could make it stop. But then I got pregnant with Lily, and everything got worse. He didn't work, just drank and yelled and more. I was scared, all the time." The room felt impossibly heavy, each word a weight added to our already burdened hearts. "Why didn't you come to us, Amy? Why didn't you tell us?" I asked, my voice a mix of pain and frustration. "I was ashamed, Mom. Ashamed and scared. I thought I'd made my bed and had to lie in it. But when Lily was born, I realized I couldn't let her grow up in that. That's when I called you for the money. It was the only way I could think of to keep us afloat." John stood abruptly, pacing the room. "And his parents? What role did they play in all this?" Amy's lips quivered as she spoke. "They were just as bad, in their own way. His mom, she would make me do all the housework, watch every penny. If I did anything wrong, she'd take it out on me, on Lily. They all would." I reached across, taking her hand in mine. "You're safe now, Amy. You and Lily. We'll take care of you." Amy nodded, a frail smile on her lips. "I know, Mom. That's why I came here. I knew if anyone would help us, it would be you." John nodded, his face set in a grim line. "Tell us how you managed it, Amy. We need to know everything to protect you." She took a deep breath, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. "It wasn't easy. I had to wait for the right moment. His parents were out, and he was passed out drunk, like usual. I grabbed Lily, some clothes, and whatever cash I could find. I didn't even have a car seat, just wrapped her in blankets and ran." I shuddered, imagining my daughter and granddaughter in such peril. "Oh, Amy, that's so dangerous. But you're here now, that's what matters." She continued, her eyes distant as she recounted the escape. "I hitched a ride to the nearest bus station. People must have seen the desperation in my eyes. No one asked too many questions. Each mile away from that house felt like a tiny victory. John's hand found mine under the table, a silent message of solidarity. And no one followed you? You were sure you weren't followed? Amy shook her head. I was careful, Dad. I know you taught me to be observant. I made sure we weren't followed. I just couldn't stay there a moment longer, not with Lily. I stood up, moving to the stove to busy myself with making more coffee, the actions mundane but necessary to keep the tremors at bay. You're brave, Amy. So brave. We'll make sure you never have to go back there. The day passed in a flurry of activity, securing the house, making appointments with lawyers and therapists, anything and everything to ensure Amy and Lily's safety and well-being. John was on the phone most of the day, his voice a low rumble of barely contained fury and action. As night fell, Amy sat on the living room floor, Lily crawling around her, a scene so normal yet charged with the undercurrents of their recent ordeal. I can't thank you enough, both of you. I feel like I'm finally breathing again. John looked up from his paperwork, his gaze softening. You're our daughter, Amy. There's nothing we wouldn't do for you and Lily. I sat down beside her, the carpet soft beneath me. We meant it when we said forever, Amy. Forever means through the hard times too. She leaned against me, her body weary but her spirit flickering with the start of something new, hope, perhaps, or the beginning of healing. I know, Mom. I know. As we settled in for the night, the house felt different, as if the very walls were bracing to protect its inhabitants. Amy and Lily slept in the guest room, their breaths soft and even in the quiet. John and I lay in bed, our hands clasped between us, a silent vow to face whatever came next together. The escape to safety was just the beginning, but as I drifted off to sleep, I knew we were ready for it. Ready to fight, to protect, and to heal. Our family, once broken, was mending, one day, one moment at a time. With resolve hardening in our hearts, John and I drove to the address Amy had tearfully provided. The house loomed ahead, shabby and forlorn, a stark contrast to the warm, loving home we had left. Ready? John asked, his voice a low rumble of contained anger. I nodded, bracing myself for what was to come. We walked up to the decrepit door and knocked firmly. Shuffling feet approached from inside, and the door creaked open to reveal Amy's husband, a picture of neglect and disdain. We need to see Amy and the baby, John demanded, his gaze steely. The husband, with a dismissive snort, replied, They're sleeping. What do you want at this hour? The blatant lie made my blood boil. Sleeping? Don't play dumb. Amy's been with us since yesterday. She told us everything. I snapped, my voice sharp with fury. Behind him, his parents appeared, their expressions sour and defensive. What's all this about? Our daughter-in-law is fine, just sleeping off her tantrums, the mother sneered, a vile attempt at nonchalance. John stepped closer, his presence imposing. You think we're fools? Amy's safe from your abuse now. She's at our house, and she's told us everything. The trio exchanged nervous glances, the facade crumbling. You can't prove anything, the father blustered, trying to regain some ground. Without a word, John reached into his coat and flashed his police badge. The effect was immediate. Their faces drained of color, their previous arrogance replaced by fear. We're just a family trying to get by, the mother whimpered, her bravado gone. John's voice was cold, the anger controlled but palpable. A family that preys on its weakest members? I don't think so. You'll be hearing from us, and from the authorities. We turned and left them there, standing in their doorway, the reality of their situation sinking in. As we drove away, the weight of what we had started hung heavy in the air. Amy, holding Lily close, met us as we walked in. Her eyes, filled with a mix of hope and fear, searched ours for answers. They're scared now, Amy. scared of the consequences. You and Lily are safe, John assured her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The night closed in around us, the house a sanctuary against the darkness outside. As we settled in, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The first step had been taken, the demons confronted. And though the journey was far from over, we had faced it together, a united front against the past and whatever future might bring. Our family, once fractured, was finding its way back, one truth, one moment at a time. The morning after confronting Amy's in-laws, John and I sat at our kitchen table, a silent agreement between us. Today we would ensure justice for Amy and Lily. John, with his years of experience on the force, made calls, his tone official and stern, setting the wheels of justice in motion. Amy, can you tell us everything again? The authorities will need your statement, John said as he prepared a notepad, his expression serious but encouraging. Amy nodded, a determined glint in her eyes, despite the shadows of her recent past. Yes, I'll tell them everything. They need to know what he did, what they all did. As she recounted her story, her voice trembled but never broke. She was a portrait of courage, a stark contrast to the frightened girl who had appeared on our doorstep. And when Lily was born, things got worse. I was isolated, controlled. I couldn't let her grow up in that. I reached over, squeezing her hand. You're doing the right thing, Amy. They won't hurt you or Lily ever again. Hours passed, filled with calls and visits from officers and lawyers, each step a move towards accountability and protection. Finally, with Amy's statement recorded and the legal process underway, we had a moment to breathe. Mom, Dad, will they go to jail? Amy asked, her eyes searching ours for assurance. John nodded, his voice firm. They're facing charges of abuse and extortion. It's a strong case, especially with your testimony. They won't be free to hurt anyone else. The relief in Amy's eyes was palpable. She hugged Lily to her, whispering words of love and safety to her daughter. The day turned to evening, and as we sat together, a sense of calm settled over the house. I can't believe it's finally happening, Amy murmured, a small smile touching her lips. It's only the beginning, sweetheart. But we'll be with you every step of the way, I reassured her, my heart swelling with pride for her bravery. John stood, looking out the window into the growing darkness. They'll learn that you don't mess with family. Not without consequences. We sat in quiet solidarity, the trials of the past few days bonding us in ways we couldn't have imagined. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of hope, a light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. As night fell and we prepared for bed, I checked on Amy and Lily, sleeping peacefully in the guest room. The sight of them, so serene, was a balm to my weary soul. We had faced the demons, and though the scars remained, we were healing, moving forward together. As the days turned into weeks, the dark cloud that had loomed over our family started to dissipate. Amy, now officially divorced and free from the man and the in-laws who had caused her so much pain, was finding her footing again. The legal proceedings had seen her husband and his parents imprisoned for their violence and extortion, a fitting end to their reign of terror. During breakfast one morning, as we all sat together, the atmosphere was lighter, almost buoyant. You know, I've been thinking, I began, watching Lily attempt to spoon-feed herself, how far we've come. It's like we've stepped into the light after such a long time in the dark. Amy, with a newfound strength in her eyes, smiled. Yeah, Mom. It's like I'm finally waking up. The divorce, the trial, it's all behind me now. I can actually look forward to the days ahead. John, always the backbone of our family, nodded in agreement. That's right. We're all moving forward now, stronger and wiser. Lily's giggles punctuated our conversation, a reminder of the innocence and joy that had returned to our home. As the day unfolded, Amy and I found ourselves in the garden, planting new flowers, a symbolic gesture of our new beginnings. Mom, can you believe how much Lily's grown? Amy remarked, her hands deep in the earth. I smiled, handing her a seedling. She's going to be as strong and beautiful as her mother, and as resilient as her grandma, too. As evening approached, John joined us outside, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. Look at our little family, Martha. This is what life's all about. I leaned into him, my heart full of gratitude. Yes, it is. A new beginning, a fresh start for all of us. Dinner was a lively affair, with Amy sharing her plans for the future, her voice tinged with excitement. I'm thinking of going back to school, maybe even starting my own business. I want Lily to have a life filled with possibilities. John raised his glass, his eyes shining with pride. To new beginnings, to family, and to justice. May we always find strength in each other. We toasted to our future, the sound of our glasses clinking a sweet symphony of hope and determination. As the night drew in, I tucked Lily into bed, watching as Amy sat beside her, a serene look on her face. I whispered a silent prayer of thanks as I turned off the light, grateful for the second chance we'd been given. As I lay next to John, his presence a constant source of comfort, I knew that our journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought us here, to this moment of peace and togetherness. Hi, I'm Marie. Mom and wife full-time, that's me. Paul, that's my husband, works the trading gig, and let's just say he's married to his job just as much as he is to me. Used to scribble down thoughts on books, reading between and beyond the lines, but these days I'm more about reading bedtime stories to our boy, Jack. Life threw some curveballs early on, lost my parents when I still needed them. That was rough. Then along came Paul, with a family in tow. His folks were the real deal, good people, you know. Took me in, no questions. Made me feel like I finally belonged somewhere again. Been with Paul for years now, since those college days when love seemed to be enough to fill any void. We settled into a rhythm, he at work and me taking care of everything else. But man, did that rhythm skip and stumble when Jack came into the picture. Paul changed, or maybe this was always him, just waiting for a reason to surface. He'd come home on a Friday night with a few too many drinks in him, loose-lipped and surly. You gotta start shedding that weight, Marie, he'd snipe after slipping off his tie. You barely fit in those jeans anymore. I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt, but I told myself to brush it off, toughen up, maybe he'd cool down by morning. But mornings just brought hangovers and silence until the next round. The house became this place where I tiptoed, trying not to set Paul off. Jack, little trooper, he could feel it too, sticking close, watching his old man with wide, careful eyes. One particularly rough Friday, Paul came home and made a beeline for the fridge, crack open a cold one. I was on the floor with Jack, blocks scattered around. Another day in paradise, huh? Paul sneered, leaning against the counter. I forced a smile. Just the usual, you know, chasing after this little tornado. I ruffled Jack's hair, but my heart wasn't in it. Paul tossed his head back, downing half the bottle. Maybe put some of that energy into a workout routine, eh? I bit my tongue, counting to 10 in my head. I'll look into it, was all I managed, shuffling Jack into his pile of toys, anything to escape the cutting edge in Paul's tone. But the weight wasn't just on my hips, it was on my chest, heavy, making it hard to breathe. I didn't know who I was in Paul's eyes anymore. I had finally shaken off those last stubborn pounds. It felt good, kind of. But Paul, well, he had a talent for finding flaws. My sweats and baggy tees were the new target. Jesus, Marie, you dress like you're living at the gym. When was the last time you dressed up? Remember how you used to look? There he was, leaning on the doorframe with that look that said everything his words didn't. I glanced down at my stretched-out mom life tee and yoga pants. This is just practical, Paul. You want me all dolled up to do laundry and wrangle our son? One corner of his mouth curled up like he had just made a successful trade. I dunno, how about looking good for your husband? That used to matter. I sighed, rolling my eyes. Well, unless my husband starts taking meetings at the playground or the grocery store, I think I'll stick with practical. He shook his head, chuckling without humor. You used to care, Marie. His voice trailed off as he wandered back toward the living room, his disapproval hanging in the air like a bad smell. Then there was Jack, our boy, trying to navigate the shaky terrain between us. I was teaching him please and thank you, thinking manners mattered. Paul caught a bit of our lesson one afternoon and scoffed. Look at you, teaching him to be Mr. Manners. You want him to get trampled on? Manners are important, Paul. It's about respect, I said, trying to keep my voice even. Respect is earned, not politeness the least, he shot back. He needs to toughen up, not be some yes, please pushover. Then the whole freeloader thing started. One night, Paul came home, askew, looking like he had won and lost the same fight. Nice day? He asked, sarcasm heavy as he glanced around what I'd come to see as our minefield of a home. I put down Jack's toy and braced for what was coming. Just the same, dealing with tantrums and spills. How was work? Paul's laugh was short and sharp. Work? Oh, it was just dandy, supporting a parasite. My cheeks burned. Excuse me? My voice was a little too loud. Jack's eyes flitted from me to Paul, sensing the shift. A parasite, Marie. I work, you play house, he said, each word pointed and heavy. That's the thanks I get? I am raising our child, Paul. Your child. That's work. That's vital, I said, my voice rising now, too. Jack started fussing then, picking up on the tension. I swept him up into my arms, trying to shield him from the fallout. Paul had a knack for knowing when he'd pushed too far, and his next words were more measured. Marie, I go out there and deal with sharks all day. Come home, and what? I don't know, something different. I can't be your one-man show, Paul, I said softly, trying to defuse the bomb that our marriage had become. I'm here, juggling a million things for us, for Jack. We looked at each other then, really looked, and I wondered if he saw the plea in my eyes. The help me, back me up, be with me that I felt screaming inside. But he turned away, the finality of his silence telling me that no, he didn't see. He didn't want to. One day, the disrespect boiled over. Jack scrunched up his little face and called me a name, a real zinger. He got it from Paul. You're just a lazy bum, he had hurled at me, his tiny voice bitter and angry. I felt like I'd been slapped. What? Jack, no, you can't say that, I stumbled, shocked. He folded his arms, stubborn as his dad. Dad says it, so can I. That was the last straw. When Paul got home, I was waiting, steaming like a forgotten kettle. You know what your son called me today? I laid into him without waiting for an answer. Paul dropped his keys on the counter and chuckled, clearly not seeing the line had been crossed. What did he say? The truth? He tossed his words over his shoulder as he walked to the fridge, his casualness like acid on my skin. Is that funny to you? I was shouting now, my usual restraint snapped tight as a dry twig. Your son is calling me names. Paul leaned against the kitchen counter, beer in hand, a smirk blooming on his face. Oh, come on, Marie. Kid's gotta learn to stand his ground. I was staring at him, hands balled into fists. By disrespecting his mother? He shrugged, a lazy lift of his shoulders that sent me teetering on the edge. You're too soft on him. Look, he's getting some spine. Spine? My voice shot up another octave. He's learning to be just like you. Paul grinned and ruffled Jack's hair. Ain't that right, champ? I turned to Jack, who was looking at us with eyes that were too old for his face. Jack, listen to me. What you said to me this morning was wrong. You can't talk to people like that. Jack's chin jutted out, defiant and stubborn. But Dad. I don't care what Dad says, you listen to your mom. I cut him off, my heart thudding like a drum. I was desperate for him not to follow in Paul's footsteps. But Paul wasn't letting it go. The boy's gotta learn to speak up. World's not gonna hand him anything. You keep coddling him, he'll end up. I get it, alright? I get it. I cut him off, feeling the weight of his words like a physical thing on my chest. But there's a line. You don't get it, do you? Paul threw up his hands, that ugly smirk still there. Whatever, Marie. You make mountains out of molehills. I turned from him, that burning in my chest now a churning mess. This is not how I want our son to grow up. This disrespect ends now, it ends here. Paul just took a swig of his beer, and I knew, right then, my words were just bouncing off him. I looked at Jack, really looked at him. You apologize to me, now, I said, the power in my voice surprising even me. Jack's eyes darted between me and Paul, but he knew that tone. Sorry, Mom. The word was small, almost lost in the kitchen, but it was there and it was a start. I moved closer to Jack, knelt down so I was eye level with him. Thank you. We treat each other with respect in this house, you got it? Paul snorted behind me, but I ignored him. Jack nodded, a hint of my boy peeking through that new sullen shadow he wore. It was a crack in the wall Paul was building around him, a crack, but also a starting point. I stood up, squared my shoulders. We're going to fix this, Jack. No more name-calling, no more disrespect. We're better than that. I took Jack's hand, and we left the room, leaving Paul and his smugness behind us. I stood there on the sidewalk, my phone shaking in my hand. It was one of those moments where your gut ties up in knots. There, across the street, Paul was laughing it up with some woman. Blonde, curvy, and looking at my husband like he was the last piece of chocolate in the box. My thumb pressed record before I even decided to. The walk home felt a million miles long. A part of me hoped it was a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew. Back in our kitchen, I threw my keys on the counter. Paul was sitting there with a beer, like he always did, but today the sight of him made me sick. Without a word, I tossed my phone on the table in front of him, the video playing. Care to explain? Paul looked at the screen, his eyes going hard when he saw what was on it. He muted it, placed it calmly on the counter, and then looked straight at me. Yeah, she's beautiful, he said, his voice dripping venom. You used to be like that. I felt the slap of his words, my cheeks flaming with anger, my body tense. So, that's it, huh? You parade around town with some woman while I'm at home? Paul stood up, his chair scraping back against the tile. He was too close now, his voice low and mean. What, you stalking me now, Marie? Can't handle the fact that maybe there's more out there than what's inside these walls? I was reeling, feeling the pieces click together. Cut the crap, Paul. You're cheating. He didn't even flinch. You want to know why, he said, his chest puffing up. Because around her, I'm somebody. Not just the guy who pays the bills or the bad guy 'cause he ain't Mr. Rogers. So that's it? I edged back, feeling the counter dig into my hips. Your family's not enough for you? Paul snorted and grabbed his beer again. It stopped being enough a long time ago. Maybe if you'd have kept up with yourself, I wouldn't have to look elsewhere. The bile rattled in my throat. I'm not the one who promised till death do us part. His laugh was short and punched the air. Those are just words, Marie. They stopped meaning anything to you a long time ago. I should have been crying, but the tears wouldn't come. I was just empty and angry. I gave you everything, Paul. I gave you a son, I made a home for us. And this is how you repay me? He took a long drink, then leaned back against the counter. You gave me a home? Looks like a prison to me. Same old, every damn day. You think that's a life? We made vows, Paul. I shouted, my voice cracking. Yeah, and you broke them every day with your sweatpants and constant nagging. His face twisted into something ugly, something monstrous. That was the last thing he said before I walked out, my heart numb, anger seeping into every corner of my being. I was on edge the whole ride over to Paul's folks' place. It was gonna be nasty, but I had to lay it out for them. They needed to know who their son really was. His mom answered the door, with a happy smile. "Marie, what brings you here at this hour?" I just barreled past her. "I gotta show you both something." Once his dad came in, I played them the video straight up. His mom gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. His dad, red-faced and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, he barked at me, "Paul's gotta stop this nonsense now." And like that, all hell broke loose. That night back at our place, Paul kicked off as soon as I walked in. "You had to drag my parents into this, didn't ya?" His voice was loaded, ready to fire. "Yeah, well someone's got to," I shot back, my nerves steel. He was a storm brewing. With a step towards me, his hand raised, but he didn't get far. "You're bad." Jack's voice cut through, strong and braver than any of us. Paul stopped stone cold. Paul's hand dropped, and his mask slipped a second, shock in his eyes. But then he hardened up again, cold as steel. "I want you out," he said, spitting the words like they were sour. "Take the kid and go." So we went. With Jack's hand in mine, I didn't look back. Bags thrown in the back of the car, we headed for the city, miles of road unwinding like my thoughts. The luxury house was something else, my unexpected inheritance. 2 stories, white columns, and a porch you could throw a party on, all waiting in another city, away from everything that had gone wrong. None of my folks, not even a whisker of Paul or his clan, had ever set eyes on it. When we pulled up to this grand house, Jack's face pressed to the window, eyes as wide as the moon. "Is this a castle?" His voice was a whisper, almost lost in the vastness of it all. "Something like that," I said, a laugh escaping me for the first time in. I couldn't even remember. We stepped into that house, our new beginning. It was silent, save for the echo of our footsteps on the marble floors, bouncing off the high ceilings crowned with crystal chandeliers. The furniture was swanky, left behind by folks I wish had lasted a lifetime longer. I plopped down on a couch soft as clouds, and finally, Jack's laughter filled the rooms. The sound of it was more luxurious than anything else in this place. We explored room after room, Jack running ahead like he was leading a parade. Each new door opened to a room grander than the last. "I call the biggest one," he declared, claiming a bedroom that overlooked a garden already blooming with the promise of spring. Laying him down to bed that night, the day finally caught up with me. My eyes burned with the tiredness of it all, but looking around at the high ceilings, the gold trimming catching moonlight, I knew we were worlds away from where we started. Sitting there, in the quiet of a room too nice for today's shadows, I whispered into the darkness, "We made it, kiddo." Life in the big house slowly shed the shadows of the past. Jack's giggles filled the halls more than the echoes of old fears. Most days, it felt like we had always been there, just the two of us, in our new safe haven. The house, with its silent strength, was keeping the world at bay, until the day Paul showed up, uninvited and unwelcome. He was at the door in a storm of anger. I opened it and there he was, looking like trouble had followed him around. "You can't just disappear with my son, Marie." I leaned against the door frame, unfazed. "He's my son too. And I didn't disappear. I moved on." Paul's scowl deepened. He glanced around, taking in the opulence of the place with wide, disbelieving eyes. "How can you afford this? I know you don't make this kind of dough." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Well, turns out I had a little left over each month. Who knew? He raised an eyebrow, a sly accusation in his gaze. "And I'm struggling to cover rent for that old place by myself. It's damn near impossible now that they jacked up the price." I shook my head. He always was good at playing the martyr. "That's not my problem anymore, Paul. I've been using my own savings to cover the gap in the rent for years. Savings that, thank God, I don't need to bleed dry for that house anymore." The greed in his eyes flared up like wildfire. What, and you're living here in luxury while I... Stop right there, I cut in. This isn't your concern. This, I motioned to the grand house behind me, is mine. Mine and Jack's. Paul took a step forward, but I didn't back down. Look, I came here to fix things. I'm saying I forgive you for all this, sneaking around. His audacity almost knocked the wind out of me, but I had a little surprise that would put the brakes on his charade. From behind the door, I pulled out the divorce papers and slapped them into his chest. And here's what I'm saying. We're done. He looked as if I'd slapped him with a physical hand, his face twisting through confusion, rage, and then settling on calculating desperation. You can't do this. What about Jack? I stood taller, my resolve like iron. I'm doing it for Jack. He doesn't need this chaos you bring. Sign the papers, Paul. It's over. He glanced from the papers to me, then back again, his posture deflating slightly. You'll regret this. You can't make it alone. That's where you're wrong. I smiled, not from humor but from a deep-seated confidence. I'm already making it, and without you, we're doing more than just fine. We're thriving. With a shake of his head, Paul looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. Instead, he turned on his heel and strode away, clutching the papers like they were a snake that could bite. Once he was gone, the house seemed to exhale with me. I closed the door gently, turning back to the life I had fought so hard for. Life had a way of tossing stuff at you, hard and fast. It was Thursday, the kind of day that should have been easy, but it wasn't. We shirked dinner for a bit, setting up ramps out of old books and watching the Lego car stupidly do flips and land upside down. Jack's laugh was infectious, the sort that wiped clean the worry lines off my face. His enthusiasm was a reminder that amid all the crap, there was still good, simple, unadulterated good. Then it came, a banging on the door that made my stomach drop and my face lose all its motherly warmth. Paul had a knack for bad timing and worse entrances. I pulled the door open and there he was, looking like he'd just come from a bar fight or lost a bet. Paul, what's up? He scowled, that usual look he gets when he thinks the world owes him. So, this the high life? You playing house with my Jack while I'm scraping pennies just to get by? Jack peeked from behind me, a knight in Lego armor. Hey, screw off, Paul. Don't talk to my mom like that. Paul's face turned a nice shade of tomato. The hell? You let him talk like that? I stood there, hands on hips. He's expressing himself. Something I should have done with you a long time ago. Jack came out from behind me, all fierce. Yeah, get lost. My mom, my rules. Paul's anger was something else, a storm that had nowhere to go. You think you're smart, huh? Talking to your old man like that. Jack squared his shoulders, a small David to Paul's Goliath. Don't gotta think. I know it. Mom knows it. Paul opened his mouth, but nothing came out. There was Jack, staring him down, waiting. This was no place for Paul anymore, no place for his bluster and noise. After a tense moment, Paul shook his head, muttered something under his breath and stormed off the porch. Jack turned to me with this look, the kind of look that said, "We got this." I nodded, all the agreement he needed. We went back to boiling pasta and racing Lego cars. That's how we do it, simple, nothing fancy. We just keep on. I was gabbing on the phone with Miss Dottie, Paul's mom, who was more my family than is now. Honey, you just holler if there's anything you need, 'kay? Her voice was always a warm blanket over the line. We're all good, Miss Dottie. Really, couldn't be better, I assured her, twisting the cord around my finger. She hummed a pleased note. Just makes my heart full to hear that. Keep on keeping on, you hear? Frank, her husband, yelled from somewhere behind her. Tell her that any time she wants to send over some of that lemon meringue, we won't complain. A genuine laugh burst out of me. Expect a pie on your doorstep soon, Frank. Exchanging a few more pleasantries, we hung up. I shook my head. If someone had told me last year I'd be mining gold from the wreckage of my married life, I would have laughed in their face. Jack pulled on my sleeve, waving his drawing like a 5-star general. "Look, Mom. This is our house." I looked down. His scribbles had heart. A big square house and 2 stick figures, a little one and a tall one, with sloppy grins and a lopsided sun shining down. The swing I'd put up for him stood out in green and brown strokes. "That's us, right?" A dumb question, really, but it made him nod with pride. "And I'm gonna sell my art, make us rich." There was serious conviction behind his toothy smile. "If you do, you're buying me that fancy coffee I've been eyeing?" I nudged him with a wink. He nodded, his expression all business. "Only the best for my mom." And just like that, the knot in my chest loosened a bit more. Sundays were like that, full of little miracles. The thing was, life had done a real number on us, but it was looking up. Paul got slammed by the door he let hit him on his way out. The fancy house he rented to impress his mistress? Turned out to be a couple of sizes too big for his wallet. Now he was cooped up in a tiny apartment, the kind of place his pride wouldn't have let him consider a year ago. And the mistress? She hightailed it the minute his pockets turned up empty and his promises hollow. But that was a tale for some other time. Right now was about Jack and me, and the park we were marching to, hand in hand. We stepped out, and the door clicked shut, a soft full stop to one chapter before immediately kicking off the next. Jack tugged me towards the park, his excitement bubbling over. I didn't glance back at our home, no need. Ahead was everything that mattered, me and my boy, parts of a world that kept on spinning, even when you felt like you'd fallen off.